Hello.
Welcome.
This is the Death of the Reader extended cut.
Our second one. I'm excited to continue.
I mean, technically it's the fourth one, but we've had to go back and do the first few.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this is where we get to put all of the episodes from Death of the Reader together for each book into one nice big bundle. You can look over it all. This is for House in the Mist by Anna Green.
Yeah. This was a fun time having to go through and try and solve the House in the Mist. We also did the Ruby in the Cauldron and the Hermit of Street.
Now, the fun thing about the House in the Mist is that it's not really a conventional mystery. It's kind of the core components of mystery fiction split into three different stories. We have the House in the Mist where we have the mystery section of what's going to happen. We have the Ruby in the Cauldron where we have the detective trying to solve something and it just doesn't work out for him. And then we have the Hermit of Street, which is this kind of creepy horror atmosphere that, puts all of the atmospherics into one weird bundle with a little bit of a puzzle. And I like the way that it splits it out.
Yeah. The puzzle isn't really the focus in the same way as with a traditional mystery novel, or I suppose collection of stories, which is what we've gone with this time. Bit of a shake-up.
I think, and we will mention this coming up a bit later on the show, but one of the key things for me is that these collection-type stories were very formative in my early experience of murder mystery. Because these are the kind of stories that you can get a bunch of, go through them really quickly, and learn a few things about how certain puzzles are constructed, about how certain archetypes are used. And I think that if you're trying to understand the genre, even though they're not really detective stories, they're really valuable to understand.
Yeah, it might even be a good gateway for people you're trying to get into murder mystery fiction, or something to take a little brunch over.
So coming up, we're going to be covering the first episode for House in the Mist, where we talked about just chapter 1 of the House in the Mist itself. Talking a bit about atmosphere, supernatural elements, how to make puzzles in short spaces, and the way that it uses characters in a really unique way.
And we'll also be speaking to Abecassis about some of the theory behind murder mystery fiction.
And also why you should be reading books even if you can't read all of them in history.
Or why you should listen to us.
This is the Death of the Reader extended cut. You're listening to Death of the Reader on 2SER. We are Flex and Herds bringing you your murder mystery world tour as we take you around the roots, inspirations, and more of all of the best detective fiction authors in history. This week, Herds, it's time to kick off with a new novel.
Flex, I have been waiting for this moment. It's my time to shine, my time to solve a mystery together.
Yeah, so we'll be moving over to a little mystery.
Was it a pun?
Yes.
Was it a mispun based on the house in the mist, but the mist outside the... You're awful.
I am.
I might even say that joke missed the mark.
We are covering House in the Mist by Anna Green. An American author. Last week we were stuck with Emile Gaboriau over in France.
Stuck with? He was lovely.
He was lovely.
I enjoyed our trape through the aristocracy of France over there.
I use stuck more in the sense that we were clinging to him fondly.
I see, yeah. We just couldn't let go. We're like a needy friend.
Exactly.
Or a dog.
But yeah, so Anna Green is said by many critics to be a disciple of the Gaboriau style of writing. And it should be interesting to see how these influences manifest themselves in what is essentially a bunch of short stories.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know what that means to be a disciple of Emile Gaboriau, but I'm looking forward to finding out. It should be good.
So yeah, House in the Mist, it's a little creepy book. It comes with 3 stories in the edition we're covering, which we'll get to a bit later on. But right now we're covering chapter 1 of House in the Mist, where our protagonist, Hugh Austen, finds himself outside of the titular House in the Mist.
Hugh Austen, who isn't actually named until the end of the first chapter, aka a quarter of the way into the novel.
Which I kind of love, actually.
It's fantastic.
It really does leave you sitting there wondering, especially in a mystery context, like, does this guy actually have anything to do with the story?
Maybe he does. His heart skips a beat at least once. I'm watching those heartbeats. My monitor is up.
But yeah, so it has an incredibly creepy introduction, this book. It sets the tone, I think, wonderfully coming into it.
We just get this beautiful description of trekking through the mountains of Pennsylvania, and like this mist is in and we're looking for a safe place to rest down for the night. But as Hugh Austen says, "What I did not realize then, as I do now, that shelter does not necessarily imply refuge. or I might not have undertaken this adventure with so light a heart. Yet, who knows, the impulses of an unfettered spirit lean toward daring, and youth, as I have said, seeks the strange, the unknown, and sometimes the terrible.
So are you suggesting to me then, Herds, that Hugh Austen knows what's about to happen?
I don't think he knows what's about to happen, but if he turns out to be a ghost at the end, or like the secret nephew, look, who knows? Who knows what he is? But there is some precedent for characters having changed their last names. I'm looking for it. I'm watching out for it.
All right, yeah. I mean, we don't really cover why he's traveling. We begin, like, it feels halfway through the story, right?
Yeah, it's very strange.
It feels as though we've just hopped along board Hugh Austen's little trek.
I mean, it's not quite in media res. It's not quite as drastic as that. Not everyone has, like, pulled their guns on each other yet. Shout out to Eunice. But we have, we've arrived in the middle of a conflict that is, being resolved in this house. And we know nothing, and our protagonist also supposedly knows nothing. And that gives us a beautiful little, blank canvas to put our impressions on, I think that in all of the other novels that we've covered so far, there's been a very, well, let's talk in our second novel, but there's been a distinction of this character is a detective, this character is an inspector, whatever their thing is. But Hugh Austen doesn't really have a thing. He just is traveling and now is there.
Yeah.
He could have just as easily picked up a book that said, this is when all these characters turn up. This is what they look like. This is a quick impression of them. How do you feel about them? And he's like, I want to go hide in the staircase.
We also have that one weird guy who just walks out the front of the house, leaves the door opens, and is like, dude, oh yeah, just head on inside. Everyone will be there soon.
Best character. I hope they come back to serve their vampire master.
Who is that guy?
If that's the guy who supposedly died and he was just making sure everything was ready to go, that'd be my favorite twist, if that's actually what happens here.
I feel like they spent too long on the portrait for him to not realize, unless you're saying that the portrait isn't the guy that's died.
We didn't get a good look at him, did he? He just he disappeared in the mist and then he shouted back.
I suppose you are right.
I'm just saying.
It doesn't sound terribly far-fetched.
Well, how would he get into the house anyway? Unless he is one of the other characters, of course. That's a possibility. That'd be fun.
All very strange.
What if it's Eunice? Anyway.
But you said you think that he might be a ghost. So are you suggesting to me that we are breaking one of Knox's favorite rules?
Look, I would like for there to be ghosts. That's the thing. When we get into the third part, we're going to talk about how when I make theories, I always go for what's fun and interesting. I don't necessarily go for what's correct. So if everybody turns out to be ghosts and they're like reliving their last moments, bickering amongst themselves, and then, wayfarers just wander into the house and get caught up in it every year or whatever, that would be fantastic. If that's the twist at the end, I would just die and become a ghost myself.
Do you feel like an author of traditional detective fiction like Anna Catherine Green would do something like that?
I mean, when you put it that way, maybe not, probably not, but it'd be fun, right? I've never read any of Catherine Green's works myself, but this is, a fun short story, so I don't think it's out of the question. I think it's more likely that they all pull guns on each other and try to murder each other, but ghosts would be fun too.
It certainly does feel like there's something supernatural going on.
There's definitely something underneath the surface, that's for sure. The way that the novel constructs this locked room puzzle, but without, we're in the locked room. There's something ethereal about being locked out from, all the ghouls outside. That's certainly the impression that I got of the other characters who haven't made it inside being pressed up against the doors and the windows trying to claw their way in. Zombies or something. It's great.
Suppose it is a locked room because the doors are locked, but I think this is more an example of a closed circle mystery.
Oh, come on.
Where people outside can't be involved. We have that fantastic scene where everyone's clawing at the doors trying to get in, and it's like, what is going on? It feels
too late.
It feels more like a horror novel in that moment than it does anything else.
That's one of the things that's really enjoyable about this mystery. I think something that sets it apart is that usually when we get our suspects and we get our characters, this is, Jacob, the vicar, and this is, Eustace, the maid. But in this, it's there were these two men who were clearly brothers, and one of them was fat and one of them was thin, and they looked horrible and they were really rude. And then this old villainous man walked in with his crony eyes and his boy slave, and it's all of the characters except for Eunice are depicted as being villainous. And I think he even says that exact line.
Yeah. It's very different from the normal murder mystery
Yeah.
fodder where we try and make everyone look as innocent as possible.
Yes. It's more a case of saying everyone here is scum. What kind of awful nonsense is going to boil over from the pot? Because that's the impression that I get. This is a powder cake. This is the impression that I get. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that, old man in the painting has died. Everyone else is like, boy, who's going to get the family fortune? And he's going to have some kind of like, you should kill each other for the money. Whoever's left standing gets the gold, something stupid like that.
I definitely think that the portrait is the most supernatural feeling element of the story to me.
Well, its eyes follow you, apparently.
Yeah, they keep mentioning it as though it's a character in the scene. It's always like there's one gaze in the room that wasn't moving.
It's the presence of someone behind the painting.
Yeah.
Dude, look, I'm just saying, if they pull that painting away and there's the old man is like standing behind it, or if he is the painting and they just don't realize, that's the twist ending that I want.
Is that our one secret passage?
That's the one. The passage of the painting leading to the old man. He's sitting in his chair and he's like, "You have all failed me. You were supposed to be good boys and girls, and you weren't. And so now I'm giving all my money to you because he's the only decent person in this stupid house."
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And then it burns down at the end, and that's the novel.
I also like how much characterization we're given in such a little time. I definitely had a doubt going into this story that we could have a compelling mystery given to us in 4 chapters.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not to say that it's unheard of, and we've definitely spoken on previous episodes about how the mystery should ideally be constructed within the opening chapters.
Yeah.
But I think that the amount that we get through in this first chapter without it necessarily feeling rushed was pretty impressive.
It doesn't feel clunky. And I think that the few details that I have noticed being particularly interesting, like the thing that Eunice is carrying and like the painting with the moving eyes, like none of those details stand out, except intentionally as being out of place, if that makes sense. I feel like the novel flows pretty well from one character introduction to the next, which is really good. It's paced very well.
Yeah, I mean, even just some of the ways that the characterization is introduced through the observations of Hugh Austen, like when characters jump at certain words, or when Eunice comes in supposedly carrying something, which you clearly think is a gun.
Yes,
like
obviously, or a baby.
It feels accurately as though Hugh Austen is in a situation he has no idea what's going on, and he's trying to figure it out. He's along for the ride with you, and I think that his perspective is very compelling because of that.
I actually think that one of the best introductions is Janet Clapsaddle's introduction, simply because we're introduced to this family. It's clearly it's a family problem, and suddenly characters coming with Witherspoon and Clapsaddle. There's only one of each of those families. It's like, well, wait a second, are they part of this or not? I thought it was the Westonhouse. I thought they were the ones that are involved in this. And then Janet has this little monologue that she gives that, cements her as one of the important people in the room. She complains about, being called a previous Westonhouse, and it's fantastic. Just look at these little paragraphs that give you all you need to know, these little bite-sized characters. It's really good.
They definitely do not seem like a loving family.
No, they're awful. They're going to literally tear each other's throats out. It's going to happen.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, same.
I think the roundup feeling that we get from this scene as well is really interesting because it certainly feels almost like the kind of scene you'd get at the end of a normal mystery novel where everyone's gathered into a room and we say, "And you are the culprit." My first impression was that we were getting everyone in this room and the lawyer was just going to go, "And you're all guilty."
Yeah, and then we get a personal anecdote on each of their parts of the crime. And then Hugh has to make it out alive somehow.
Do you reckon if they're all going to claw each other's throats out that Hugh Austen will have to fight for his life, or do you reckon that he's been safely whisked away behind that little wall?
Oh, he has to become part of it, surely. That's like the most fun thing. Why would you have a murder mystery and not have your protagonist like get caught up in it?
Oh, definitely. But my question is more, do you think they're going to come after him? Or do you think he's just going to get caught up in the middle of it?
I mean, I think that since we have a lawyer here and we have a whole bundle of documents with all sorts of obscure and specific rules, I think that one of the reveals is going to be, and the first person who came into the house is the one who gets the money. It's not actually going to matter what your last name is.
That's why.
That's how they're going to pull him in.
So you think that's why he, as an outside character, has been introduced?
Yeah, I think that he's going to get caught up in it. I hope so. That'd be the most fun thing. That's in my humble opinion as a mystery avid fanatical reader. I think that Austin, he has to get caught up in it somehow, if for no other reason than because his heart jumped at the mention of Eunice's name.
Oh my.
Oh my.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing your theories on this coming up a bit later in the show. But right now, we have Dr. Jack Abecassis from Pomona College in the United States on the line to talk about Death of the Reader. Not us, the theory. Stick around. You're listening to Death of the Reader on 2SER. This is Flex and Herds, and we're joined here by Professor Jack Abecassis from Pomona College in the United States, an expert on French literature, and the person from which we ripped our name, Herds.
What? Why would we do that? Why would you admit that on air? Come on, Flex.
Anyway, Professor Jack Abecassis, welcome to the show.
Hello, I'm happy to be with you.
Yeah, so our show, Death of the Reader, asks our audience to engage in puzzles and look at texts and kind of unravel them themselves. This in itself is kind of a form of amateur literature analysis. Now, our only qualification is that we have these fancy microphones and have read a few novels. Why should people engage in this kind of criticism, and what is the reason people should listen to us and engage in literature analysis, even though they haven't read everything or have no academic qualification?
I think the most obvious reason is that there are very few other activities that delight human beings as much as narratives, engaging in narratives, and all the cognitive work and cognitive joy that goes with narrative puzzles and so on. So you're actually, to the extent that you're successful, you're actually tapping into something very deep in the human psyche.
So do you think that with this amateur literature analysis, obviously people haven't read everything that's out there and people haven't engaged with every text in the field. Why should people feel confident and actively engage in doing things, even though they don't have that expertise? I know your text, Peer by Art and Death of the Reader, which criticized a particular point of view on this, went into how people, don't get to read everything. So why should they explore things that they can't have a complete understanding of?
First of all, I think none of your readers should have any harbor any complex about not having read everything, because, first of all, for the simple reason that no one really has ever read everything. Perhaps the last person, at least in Western civilization, to have done so in a significant way is Leibniz, and that dates us back to the 18th century. So every so-called expert in literature is somebody who has tapped into a certain vein and knows and understands and is familiar with the major arguments in that vein. So let's call it Shakespeare's studies or Cervantes studies and so on. And that's about it. And in that sense, a literary training is not that different than training in engineering. When you study engineering, you do not study how to solve each and every possible problems. You basically learn how to solve problems giving general principles of mechanics and physics and so on. So it's exactly the same thing with literature. And so that I think that anybody who is literate and who is interested in narrative is perfectly capable of engaging with literature in a very meaningful way.
How in fields that are increasingly saturating content can we distinguish between nodes and hubs and ensure we're not just becoming inundated with noise? Right.
Yeah, no. So this is one criticism that I had of this book by Pierre Bayard, which is simply that he has a very, let's call it a very naive idea of how network theory works. So I think the easiest way for your listeners perhaps is to think about the systems of airports in Australia. And without knowing the details, I assume that you have 2 or 3 major airports, and let's call them hubs. And those hubs are basically send out spokes to smaller cities. Well, this is how all networks work. And therefore, when you study literature, what you really want to understand in any given field is what is the hub and what are the spokes. And so it is very important, let's say, if you study Renaissance or 17th century England, to study Shakespeare or something like that. But if you study each and every of the minor playwrights, it is not as interesting. It will not give you really kind of the keys. So the key to understanding the question of quantity in literature, the immensities of libraries, the immensities of catalog, is to understand that in all the millions of books out there, there are very, very few books that actually make any difference. And what's important when you get an education is for you in any field. So, for example, you guys talk about detective novels, is to recognize what are the 50 most important detective novels, let's say, in a given period or in a given culture, and to become familiar with that. Reading the other 10,000 very minor detective novels is not something that is really going to illuminate you a great deal, so or teach you a great deal. So this is one aspect of network theory that Pierre Bayard simply does not understand. And for him, it's one flat surface where, in fact, it is kind of an Everest mountain where there are very few peaks that count.
In that case where we have certain novels that you say aren't as illuminating and won't teach you as much about a subject as other novels in the field, how do we ensure that those novels out there that do have, the miracle cure hidden in them aren't just lost amongst the noise because they're not found, as people mainly stick to the 50 best things in a genre?
Right. So, this is just an ongoing process. And by the way that we think about those very important novels changes over time. And it's not something that is understood and fixed once and for all. So basically every culture, and I'll talk about the cultures that I'm familiar with, but let's say French culture and European cultures in general. Every culture has an idea of what those books are. So if you talk about 19th century French novels, people understand that there are certain novels by Balzac, by Stendhal, by Victor Hugo, by Flaubert, by Maupassant that, and they're not, if you read 20 of these novels, you really have a good grasp as to what is a 19th century French novel. You do not need to read the other 1,000 interesting novels that were written at the time, if what you want to do is sort of get the essence of it. And similarly, in Spanish culture, you want to read Golden Age theater, and you want to read Cervantes, Don Quixote, the Cervantes stories, and it's very clear to Spanish, or let's say at least Castilian culture, what is it that forms their sort of national literary identity. So, and basically the role of people such as yourselves is to kind of modulate it for people in the genres that you work in, and the kind of work that you do is very similar to the kind of work that we do at the university, which is to present to students a landscape in which you tell them what are the really salient features, and then, of course, allow them when they go home during the summer or when the rest of their life to fill in the gaps. But if you really teach them how to think about the most salient books in a given field, you're giving them the language and the ability to deal with all the secondary and tertiary material that is out there. And so a show such as yourself, in fact, if you think about what you're doing, I've not yet, unfortunately, heard your show, a complete episode of it, but I'm sure that you're there in a way to kind of sift through certain type of books and then see how that resonates with your listeners. And I think in this dialogue between you, the sifters, and your audience, there is some kind of a consensus as to what counts. That's exactly how literary canons come about.
Well, thank you for the vote of confidence. We appreciate it over here in Tuasia, Death of the Reader. But I think it's very interesting you talk about how our job, the job of academics and scholars, is to sift through information to find relevant texts But with the presence of social media, Facebook and Twitter, where we're almost being told what other readers are engaging in, how has that changed the playing field when it comes to finding relevant information?
God, that's a huge question.
We ask the hard-hitting
That
questions.
is a huge question. I think that you have to look at it dialectically. You have to see what is positive, which is, for example, I just published an article recently about reader reaction to Gillian Flynn's novel Gun Girl, right? And actually in Amazon, there are 35,000 reactions to her novel Gun Girl, which was also turned into a movie. So I think that on the very positive side, social media allows readers to become very active in terms of interacting with books and authors and so on, and give them feedback in real time. I imagine that the negative side of it is that this kind of mimetic contagion that goes on, things become hot. There is a great deal of mimetic desire that is going on. So, for example, if you're an influencer and you read a book and you tell your 10,000 or 50,000 followers in Instagram that this book is a must read, then they read it just by pure desire to imitate you, that is to become you, to become like you, and so on and so forth. But I tend to believe that if the influencer, let's say, recommends a book that does not truly resonate and does not have real intrinsic quality, it'll be like a quick brush fire. Whereas the books that tend to be more beefy and more interesting will endure much longer. So it's a very complex issue. I don't think social media tilts it one way or the other. It has very positive aspects, and it has the negative aspect of it, which is it allows this kind of contagion of mimetic desire that is wanting to imitate and be like the hero with whom you identify. So the people who are influencers for you, and allowing them to sort of dictate too much of what you like. So it's just, how shall I say, it is just amplifying a human tendency of imitation of sort of alpha human beings. And it amplifies that. It becomes a very important vector for it. It does not change the basic mechanism. It's always been that way.
I think one thing that's particularly interesting for us, where the golden age of detective fiction was so long ago, before so many of these structures for information transfer were developed, we can look at authors like Emile Gaboriau and Anna Catherine Green and see there's a direct line of influence between them, where that can be a lot harder to spot in the modern sphere, where there's so many more things to be influenced by. And I think the thing I wanted to move on and talk about was, for us, looking at Anna Catherine Green, an American author inspired a lot by the styles and romanticisms and kind of performative-like structures that Gaboriau and similar writers back in the era of the feuilleton, I believe it's called, those serial releases. How is that kind of segmented and serially released structures of French storytelling from the 20th and 19th centuries influenced modern American writing today?
Well, I mean, this is very interesting. So let's just take the first aspect, which is the serial aspect of it. So all French literature in the 19th century, including, the Wuthering Heights, let's say, of Madame Bovary and Sentimental Education by Flaubert, all of these novels were first released as weekly or monthly installments. So the fact that detective fiction also participated in that kind of literary dissemination is not exceptional and is not surprising. So I think that's very important to understand. All French novels, at least basically from Balzac onward, for the vast majority of them, they were always serialized. And that's how actually they gained readership. Once people read the serial installments, they then spend the money to get the whole book and just have the ability to read it in one shot. And that's how books gain notoriety. In terms of detective writing, it's actually very interesting because the relationship between American literature and French literature is not a one-way thing. Obviously, it's really a give and go. So I'll give you two quick examples. Edgar Allan Poe, who is arguably one of the earliest and best detective writers, was translated into French by the great French poet Charles Baudelaire. And the writings, and then these translations of Edgar Allan Poe by Baudelaire spawned a whole type of imitative writing in France. So it had a great deal of influence. I think if I go a little bit later, if we go to film noir, which is kind of a cousin, cinematic cousin to detective stories, if you look at American film noirs of the the middle 40s to the mid 50s, those movies had tremendous influence on the French new wave of cinema. So all of the new wave sort of auteur cinema, they were obsessed with American noir film. And then, this is what's so interesting, these French new wave films then became iconic films for people like Scorsese or like Tarantino and so on. And they started imitating French imitations of American Hollywood movies of the 1940s. So you see like what kind of a hole of mirror we have here, where we have something that is exported from the United States to France. Somehow in France it is repackaged in a very interesting way. And then it turns backward towards the United States, and it inspires American new wave people like Tarantino, Scorsese, and so on. So it's a complex relationship. It's not at all some kind of a metropolitan area and colonial sort of center and periphery. These are two centers that are ping-pong with each other.
Yeah, I think a lot of people see, media influence as a very one-directional thing historically, and only see it that modern media communication has allowed us to have multi-directional influences. But I find it really fascinating the way you talk about their hall of mirrors, as you say. How do you think that has changed the way that we view international cultures, given that there's a very close media relationship between what France produces and what America produces? Has that kind of broken down barriers between cultures, do you think?
So I would say two parts to it. Obviously, there are some asymmetries here. So let's say in the realm of literature, France has, at least of prose literature, France with England had to, was very dominant. Let's say until about the middle of the 20th century. And in the realm of movies and entertainment and so on, definitely Hollywood has been more influence, much more of a center of influence and global influence. But at the same time, I tend to look at culture as, yes, there are asymmetries, but there's always borrowings. There's always the way that the culture does not become, let's say, feral or does not become sterile is by constantly borrowing in a very lateral way from other cultures. So you could see that in the interaction between, let's say, Japanese movies and American movies. You could look at certain Kurosawa movies, and you could see that Kurosawa is thinking about certain Western, American Western movies, and at the same time he's doing something very different. And Kurosawa himself would then move on to influence, or Ozu or people like that will move on to influence American movie makers. So there is always this give and take. Of course, at any given moment, it is to be France, Great Britain, the United States now. Perhaps one day it'll be China or some other country. I have no idea. There's always going to be a center of gravity somewhere, but the only way that it doesn't become sterile is by constantly sort of borrowing from other people and being influenced by other people. That's why festivals and places like that are very important, and also studying things in a comparative way. By the way, it was the same thing in the history of the novel. The novel until about the 18th century was a very minor genre, and then the British started, let's say, with Stern and Fielding, starting to write very serious novels, which then influenced the French. The French would influence the British, the German, and so on and so forth. All these cultures were always talking to each other. So there will be a day when Bollywood will influence Hollywood, and where Chinese cinema will influence American cinema. I mean, if you just think about the history of cinema, we're talking about 100 years or 120 years. It's a very short period of time. And even within that short period of time, we see a number of cross currents that are fertilizing each other.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating seeing how that kind of network theory parallels what we were talking about earlier. And
yes.
I suppose that's something that's very prevalent through anything that has influences like media does. But either way, thank you very much for joining us, Jack. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. And thank you so much for putting Death of the Reader to paper, because that's what gave us what we are today.
The most important thing, thank you, the most important thing, the reader is not dead. Always remember, there are more people reading books today than ever before. There are more people going to the opera today than ever before. There are more people engaged in culture today than ever before. And so all of these catastrophic sounding statements about the death of cultures are really misplaced, in my opinion.
Yeah, I definitely agree. That's almost part of the reason I chose the name for the show, is that it's almost making fun of the people that say culture is dead, where really we're just saying that we're a show about murder mystery.
Yes. Well, thank you so much.
This is Death of the Reader. We are discussing House in the Mist, and that was Jack Abecassis from Pomona College in the United States. You're listening to Death of the Reader on 2SER. We are flexing herds. Thank you to Paul Meter for these lovely tunes behind us, accurately capturing the mysterious moods of our novel today, House in the Mist by Anna Catherine Green. We are covering just chapter 1 because it's a very short story.
Yeah. It's nice for a change. It's nice to have a little laid-back episode where there's no pressure on you to solve everything. It's just nice and chill. Nice and easy, I'd say.
You think you're getting out of this without trying to solve it, Herds?
No, I never said that. I'll give it my darndest I will.
All right, we are discussing, as I said, Chapter 1, and Herds, with just the information presented in Chapter 1, you are challenged to try and figure out what is going on here. Who is the culprit? Is there a culprit?
I think that everyone will be the culprit by the end.
Really?
But yes. I think I stand by what I said, that there was an old man who died, but he might be alive. That's the part I'm kind of iffy on. But he's laid down this will that's like, everybody who is related to me, come into the house, and there I will decide who gets the fortune. And then the lawyer's going to roll out the little bit of document. It's going to say, the last person alive gets all the money, or like the person who spends the night, or maybe it's split between the group of them. That would actually make the most sense now I think about it. They're like, here's like $1 million and there's like 8 of you in there. Because we do see that they all have a frown on their face as each person moves into the house. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was the agreement, that of all the people who come into the house, they like split it that number of ways.
Well, that definitely would explain the rapidity with which the others claw at the doors.
That's the theory I'm gonna go with in terms of how the money's to be handed out. Which obviously, it doesn't directly say you must kill each other, but it says, all right, the more people are in the house when dawn comes, the less money I'm gonna get. So there's some reason to start murdering people. And out of all of the people in the house, Eunice stands out to me as being the most suspicious, because she's holding something and she's deliberately described as not being suspicious, therefore making her the most suspicious.
I 100% agree.
Good.
Eunice is the most suspicious character because she's the only character that's really given detail beyond she looks evil.
Yes. I mean, she doesn't even get that. She doesn't get she looks evil. It gets, she was a lovely woman and I thought she was beautiful and I really want to marry her or whatever. That's what he was saying in his mind, when his heart like thumps a few beats faster. That's what they would put in if there were more than 4 chapters. They put that monologue in. But yeah, I think that Eunice, I don't know if she is going to go around murdering people with a spork or anything like that, but I think she has some kind of weapon on her. I think that's what she's got concealed. Or equally plausible, something to blackmail another member of the house with to like make them do the killing. I think that just based on what kind of character she is, being like the beautiful woman who, she's what a victim or whatever. I think that she's going to end up convincing other people to do her dirty work, to like kill each other or that sort of thing. That's the impression that I get from her character.
So you think that her nice visage that we get given via Hugh Austen is the front that she's putting up to get him to do her bidding?
I don't know about him, maybe, but I definitely think that she's going to try and use her charm and her her innocence, her like innocent look. She's going to use that to kind of weave her way through the killings. And I think that she's going to be like the big bad at the end, whether she pulls a gun on Hugh or she says, "Oh, but now we both survived. Isn't that fun?" And Hugh's like, "Wait a second, but that guy with the blunt object through his face and nobody could have done it but her? Oh no."
I see. So you think that the murder in this murder mystery is yet to happen?
I mean, that's the question, isn't it? Whether it's going to be an actual murder in this part of the story or whether the old man was murdered. We're trying to figure that out. Which is also something that's crossed my mind. It's only one chapter in, but hey, that's the fun part. I think that it's equally possible that we are going to spend the next 3 or I guess 2.5 chapters or so before we get the reveal, trying to figure out who had cause to murder the old man.
I see.
Yeah, that's equally possible.
You think he's an old man?
I don't even remember.
They didn't really ever state his age.
You're right. They didn't say he was an old man. They said that he had like a noble gait and mountainous singular chin.
I mean, do you feel as though he's the kind of person that would get a portrait of himself when he was old? Or
I'll be honest, I'm just thinking of Alex of Brennenberg from Amnesia: The Dark Descent. That's just stuck in my head right now. Yeah, that entire image of the sunken face, but
I have absolutely no clue.
It's an excellent story. There's a little bit of murder. It's not really a murder mystery game. Anyway, point is, go play Amnesia. Now, I think it is possible that it is a young man or an old man. I don't think it matters. The point is, he's a vampire. And I think, that it's also possible that our conflict is not who kills each other now to survive the night. We could be, which one of you killed him, And then we go back and forth trying to accuse each other. I definitely want there to be some bickering. Like, I feel like that has to be the central kind of tension or the action, of this next chapter. I want to see these cousins and brothers arguing amongst themselves about who did the deed. What it was her. I'm going to pin it on her. And then they say, "Oh no, it wasn't me. It was that man over there. It was the old crone. It was Witherspoon with his red eyes. He killed him with the knife. He made his brothers sick."
It sounds to me like you're expecting a terrible lot to happen in not very much time.
I reckon you could do it pretty quick. You just got to escalate really quickly, and that'd be fun.
I don't know. You've suggested that we have vampires. I think I can agree with that. I think that vampires, ghosts, this definitely feels very supernatural. You don't just have a house in the mist in, the mountains of Pennsylvania.
It's true.
Mist in the mountains, it just doesn't happen.
It's not quite Transylvania, but we're close.
I see. That's what you think the reference is.
Is this the House of Dracula? I'm not saying it is. I can neither confirm nor deny that this is the abode of a great vampire of death who sucks people's blood. But if it was, I wouldn't be surprised.
I mean, to my mind, it feels as though this is more the kind of story where Smead is the Pied Piper, and we've called everyone here to, play out his merry game.
You think he's in charge?
This is the Jigsaw type moment, right? Oh. Where, the guy in the portrait is clearly still alive, and Smead's, trapped him in a basement or sent him off and told him that he has friends coming over for supper, and that's what he's leaving for at the start, right?
Sure.
He's just like, "Oh yeah, Smead, you can use the house for dinner. I'm just going into town for a bit."
I think that if a situation like that is going on, then Smead is working for the man in the portrait.
Really?
Yeah, like why not? Why would Smead just do that on his own?
The stern-visaged man is going to come back in and be the hero and stop the vile crimes of Smead?
That sounds like garbage. If that's what happens, I throw the book out. I'm burning it. That's what's happening.
Whoa.
Don't burn books, kids.
Don't burn books. it's very difficult to press you for questions in this story because you
There's
have
not a lot to work with.
so little. Yeah, like
Yeah.
you have so little material.
I'm just telling you, this is the thing. This is the thing about me and the way that I like to theorize. I'm like, what is the most fun thing?
Yeah.
I want to see them fight. I want to see them be like, let's like go off in the different rooms, and then oh no, someone's dead. It was Eunice who told them to kill that other person. I was, something like that. I think that'd be fun. It'd be a fun.
You're
time.
very, very suspicious of Eunice. And
I
it
don't
seems
trust her.
Like, I don't know.
She looks too innocent to not be evil.
On the one hand, I totally agree. On the other hand, I feel as though we wouldn't have enough time to accurately explore why she is incredibly evil.
I mean, why you wouldn't have any time to explore any other character? What do you mean? Why is she unique? Because
Do you
she's not
think that
portrayed
we
as villainous.
need to get character explanation? Do you think that this story is going to be about character exploration?
I mean, it doesn't have to be like a character study, but I think that there should be some explanation of why Saul would commit a murder, for example. And I definitely think that the theme of like, this person appears to be innocent, but actually they're the killer the entire time. Like, I think you could do that in 4 chapters. A quick little side job,
It doesn't sound incredibly far-fetched.
No, I think that's pretty fine. Smeed, I don't know if I think Smeed is like, I don't think he's the mastermind. I don't think that's possible. He's far too like jovial and lighthearted. I think if anything, he's working for somebody else, something like that. I don't think that he is the evil mastermind.
One of the crazy things that I came up with along the way is I thought here that Hugh Austin was going to end up being the mastermind. I thought we were going to break Father Knox's dear rule that number 7, that the detective himself must not commit the crime. I mean, Austin isn't necessarily the detective, so it's a bit of a loose definition, but he has our perspective. I felt as though him being so out of place obviously felt intentional. Maybe the guy leaving the house at the beginning was actually just a story he told to the other house guests when they showed up.
Maybe. I think he's far too obviously like a blank slate character, and he doesn't have any input. Nobody recognizes him unless we have a whole chapter explaining, makeup. Like if we had a paragraph in the first chapter that was, let me tell you about how this character is a makeup artist and they work in a traveling circus or whatever, and they can tell you, this is how I made this person look like a completely different person. You know what? I even turned a man and I made them look like a woman, some crazy nonsense like that. Then maybe, but nobody recognizes him. They say, maybe he's part of one of those other families, but even Smeed doesn't seem to recognize him.
I mean, my thought there was that maybe Smeed had been paid off.
Maybe.
That was my original thought.
I mean, it wouldn't be terribly difficult to pay Smeed off. Let's be real.
Yeah, he doesn't seem like he's a particularly upright guy other than what's on the piece of paper he's been paid to read out.
I definitely agree with that. I think that the chances of Smeed being an accomplice of some sort are very high. What if there's a Eunice Smeed culprit theory?
I
A
see.
you need theory, if you will.
I feel as though you haven't touched on like any of the other characters, and I know we
the
both
problem-
agree here that they have very little to them, right?
This is the problem with setting up an entire room full of villainous looking characters. They are villainous in different ways. One is large, one is thin. One is a large, dowdy woman, and another is a rickety old man. Like, they all have their quirks, but we don't really know anything about them, right? Like, in my mind, they're all equally villainous. I don't think that any of them stick out to me other than Eunice.
What do you think that villainy is? I feel as though the fact that we've had that villainous look introduced means that we probably are going to flesh it out in one way or another.
Sure.
So what is that?
I mean, greed? Like, it sounds like everyone is really greedy for money. I feel like that's going to be the thing that everyone has this villainous look about. Like, they all want the family gold or whatever. That's the vibe that I'm certainly getting.
Because I feel as though the simplest, way to break that down would be to say that this is the foreshadowing for when they all bear their vampire fangs later on. But I don't know. It's
Are
like,
you telling me that there's a curse on the gold? Is that what's happening? Are you telling me that the mist is a villainous look inducing mist?
I mean,
Drug X?
we never get to see how evil Hugh Austin looks.
Oh my goodness. Maybe everyone looks evil to everyone else except for Eunice because she is the mist. She's a ghost!
Oh, and she's immune, of course.
Because
right.
she's a ghost,
Yes.
and ghosts don't get infected by the mist. That's the rules.
Indeed. Yeah, I don't know. It's so fascinating how many questions this story sets up in its first chapter without actually telling you what those questions are.
Yeah.
And I think, Herds, I'm definitely impressed with some of your reasoning here.
Good. I'm glad.
Very disappointed in other parts.
Look, you win some, you lose some, but I'm going to win this one. Look, I still have one more one more week to solve this. I have plenty of time.
That's right. But in fact, next week, you also have to solve an additional story, my friend. Next week, as well as Chapter 2 of House in the Mist, we'll be covering one of the other short stories in this little tome here.
Tell me more. What is it called?
The Ruby and the Cauldron.
The Ruby and the Cauldron?
Yes.
They're both important then. I'll keep an eye on them.
I think you should. Just like you should keep an eye on the House in the Mist. Either way, thank you for joining us here on Death of the Reader this week.
Yeah, it's been great being here. I'm going to solve it this time,
I
ladies
hope
and gentlemen.
so. You currently have no points standing.
I need to get a point.
Sean Britton took all of your points a few weeks ago.
He ruined me completely. And I'm left with nothing but the clothes on my back and the fight and the spirit in my heart. And by golly gee, I'm going to get him back. We've been flexing herds. This was Death of the Reader on 2SER.
And that was House in the Mist, Episode 1. Fun little time. I really enjoy getting to speak to Jack Abecassis. Obviously, we named the show after a piece that he wrote.
Yeah, we shamelessly stole that. Fun fact.
So that was really cool getting a chance to speak to him. I hope you guys enjoyed that.
Yeah, we continue this this next part with talk about the Ruby and the Cauldron.
Yes.
A fun little mystery, not really any murder. A ruby goes missing and we try to puzzle out who has taken it. But we'll talk about the whole thing this time, so not too much of a mystery to puzzle out. We also get to have a chat with Anna Fienberg,
yes,
the author of the Tashi series, which I was personally very excited to have on the show. She wrote a couple of children's books that I read as a small bean, so looking forward to that one.
When Hertz was actually originally pitching getting Anna Fienberg on the show, I was like, I recognize that name. And he's like, she wrote Tashi. I was like, oh, yes, those ones.
The little gnome with the impossible hair.
Yes, I love it. Most people think it's a hat.
It's definitely not a hat. The way that thing curls, that's being held together by products that he's keeping an entire village in business.
Dude, if only we could buy that product.
That would be the dream.
Life-changing.
The dream.
This is House in the Mist, Chapter 2, and The Ruby and the Cauldron on Death of the Reader's Extended Cut. You're listening to Death of the Reader on 2SER. We are flexing herds, and it's time, herds, for something very, very silly.
You know, I thought this was going to be hard. I thought this was going to be a challenge to overcome, a puzzle to brag about solving. But in the end, it was just a big farce. And it was fantastic.
It was amazing. So what we are covering today, we're covering two stories as part of one book, The House in the Mist, which contains The House in the Mist, Ruby and the Cauldron, and The Hermit of Blank Street.
Which we're not doing yet.
Today we're covering The Ruby and the Cauldron and Chapter 2 of The House in the Mist.
So technically we're doing 1 1/4 of a story.
I suppose so.
But we're here to talk about the Ruby and the Cauldron first.
We are.
I insist that we spend at least 10 minutes talking about this.
I will gladly. It's so much fun.
It's one of those mystery stories because I feel like one of the big discussions that we're going to have on this show is between, stories that are these big drama fests and they're all about the character and the progression and these plots and da-da-da-da. And then there's going to be the other side, which is all about the puzzle and the game and solving things. This story doesn't really do either of them particularly well. It's just a fun time.
Yeah.
It's just exciting to watch the detective run around interrogating people and watch his one and only skill be completely wasted.
Yeah, I mean, I very explicitly wanted to do this story because it kind of gives you a window into my early murder mystery experience.
Yeah.
Right? When we were first getting into murder mystery stories, I sat down and I found a bunch of short stories to try brush up on, how closed circles works and how locked rooms work and how all of these logic puzzles work. And a lot of them were these really goofy, light-hearted, offbeat things like this. A lot of them weren't even necessarily murders, but they still kind of showed you the same verbal tricks that let them get away with these stupid games.
Yeah. For sure. Which is interesting in that we're supposed to be a murder mystery world tour, but we do enjoy crime that does not involve murder. Sometimes it's okay to enjoy a less intense story, and I very much feel like that's the vibe we're going for here. I've had some experience with some short murder mysteries myself, or short crime mysteries, mostly in the form of 60-second mysteries, which are all terrible. They're all really easy to solve, or so convoluted they just make no sense. The solutions to those mysteries are just, the door doesn't open that way.
Well, don't spoil them. We can't have them on
Well,
the show.
I'm not gonna tell you what the mystery is. Maybe down the track we'll have them. Hebrew is written in the you turn the page from left to right instead of right to left. Mysteries like that. This sort of short story is really fascinating to me. I don't think I've read something quite of this length and of this tone. I really like the way that we're introduced to a detective whose name I've completely forgotten.
I don't even think he gets a name. He's just told to refer to himself as Jennings, and that's it.
Maybe that is his name.
Maybe it is.
Maybe that's the secret of this whole novel. But yeah, I love how Jennings, I'm calling him that now.
Mm-hmm.
Jennings is introduced to us as being, clever and discreet, unlike his compatriots who are clever or discreet, but not both. It's like a logic puzzle, essentially, for us to puzzle through in the opening.
I mean, I think that sets the tone really well because it's a very goofy line
It
where
is.
he's like, I can't pick Hicks, I can't pick Henderson. It immediately
I'll
lets
have
you
to
know
go.
what you're getting in
Yeah,
for.
it's fantastic. I'm gaining an appreciation for Catherine Green's writing, I think, by reading through this little story about the ruby and the cauldron, which is a very misleading title because one of those objects is not actually seen until the very end, and the other is only in it for about 3 sentences of dialogue and narration.
Well, I mean, at least the story revolves around the ruby. The cauldron is just an item that is brought in and then exit stage left.
I'm just saying it'd be like calling it the One Blues Brother and the Penguin.
Right.
And then that's just the movie. I'm just saying, I feel like that would make as much sense.
Yeah, I almost get the feeling that there was a story coming out at around the same time called The Ruby, and Anna Catherine Green was just like, damn it, I was going to use that one.
Throw it out, rewrite the script, but no, throw a cauldron in, we're all set.
Yeah, I think that there are maybe some people who've jumped onto the show and they're thinking to themselves, well, I've read this, and this wasn't a murder mystery.
No.
This wasn't really a mystery. It was just a story.
It wasn't even around the world. It was just in one small
but
mansion.
I think that looking at these stories and how they've influenced other stories around them, the way that the authors of actual big crime murder mysteries use these as palate cleansers, that's what a lot of these short stories are. That's why a lot of them are so iconic, because what had happened is a lot of these authors would get on this roll of writing big long stretches of complicated stories and then just go I've run out of puzzles. We spoke with Simon Brett a few weeks ago and he was saying that a lot of the puzzles have all been done. And this was a way a lot of the authors back in the day reset themselves before they went back into the grind of making these complex stories. And Anna Catherine Green is just one example of that.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's really nice. I think it's good that a well-established author can get away with this sort of thing. They're not expected to write the same sort of story every single time, or even to write to the same caliber. Not to say this is an enjoyable novel, but it's certainly no long epic tale full of twists and turns and puzzles and such and so forth. It's a very simple, straightforward story, and it's almost like a fairy tale or like a very simple play. There is no real villain, there is no antagonist. It's just we gotta find this ruby, and that's it. That's the entire story. Which I like a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing I should bring up is how it is a palate cleanser for the audience as well as for the author. Because, a lot of the reviews that I saw of this compendium, The House in the Mist, spoke about how this is a story you can tackle over breakfast and then go about your day. You don't have to sit down at night and plot out this is how this works and this is how this works. It's just, here's a story. I've read the story. We're out of here.
I wouldn't want to stay up too late over this particular story, no.
Of course, you did mention earlier, Herds, our detective Jennings.
I'm sticking with it. The Big J.
I'm sticking with it as well.
Big J man. That's his name now.
I'm pretty sure he's only ever referred to as Jennings, but I'm really second guessing myself.
It doesn't matter at this point. We've committed to this man.
Yeah.
It's Jennings, J man, the Big J.
The Big J.
J Sizzle.
But the Big J, his one ability, which is given to you right out the gate, is that he's always judging people's countenance, how they carry themselves.
He's a
looking at
judgy.
people.
He's a judgy Jennings.
He's a judgy Jennings. There you go.
Terrible. And yeah, the one thing that he's good at is reading faces, specifically human faces, because that's, all he can do, because he's an amateur detective, clearly. But it turns out that he needed to be reading the horse's face the entire time.
Yeah, it absolutely invalidates his seemingly only skill.
I mean, it invalidates the entire investigation. There's the thing. We have a character we've never heard of, Mr. Spencer, come in at the last second after the big, detective, Rube Goldberg machine. There's always that moment where the detective says, this is the plan to catch the criminal in the act, good sir. And he puts his cap on his head and he goes to work and he puts it all together. And that's your big climax, right? The ruby was in the cauldron the entire time. But it's completely subverted. And then it's just a horse. And that's the fun part. That complete subversion of expectations. And I mean, that's what all comedy is built on. And Anna Catherine Green clearly knows what she's doing in that regard, which I like a lot. It's also kind of nice that we have a murder mystery or a mystery, I should say. A story? A story, I guess.
Story.
We have a story where everything just turns out okay. No one goes to the gallows. No one kills himself.
You don't think that horse is getting put down?
No, it's they laugh too hard at that horse. They could never do anything awful to it. It doesn't know any better. I am just saying I'm campaigning rights for that poor horse. It didn't know. It didn't know the value of a ruby. How does a horse know? Well, they can't eat it.
We're all about the fairness of stories here on this
That's
show.
What we're here for. We're here to judge, jury, and execute that horse, but not actually execute because that'd be mean. That's all I'm saying.
Now, the question I have for you,
yes,
Herds, is do you think it would have been possible to predict that it was the horse?
No, get out. I don't believe you. If you say you did, I don't care.
I did not.
Sure. Now you say you didn't. Yeah.
I did not. However, I will contend to you, I think it's possible.
No, how? What clues are there?
Because
there was a horse nearby?
No, because they spend the entire introduction of the story complaining about traffic.
No! That's not good reasoning. It's like the opposite of good reasoning.
It's not good reasoning, but it is foreshadowing.
I guess it is. Technically, foreshadowing is the best kind of foreshadowing after all.
We're also told when Harrison's first giving his account of the tale that there is nobody nearby, and unless it was one of the ladies that pickpocketed it, provided the account of the incident was correct, it meant that the only creatures living that were nearby enough to have done anything was the horse and John Dean.
My theory that I had running with me that I thought was going to be like the solution was that Harrison was going to be the one behind it, but that he asked one of the ladies, or maybe it wasn't even that he asked them, but he implied if only someone could find that ruby, I'd love them forever, And then Miss Glover, who's in love with him, which turns out to be true. So I got that at least, but
you should be so proud of yourself.
I should be. I am proud of myself, but I thought that there was going to be something there where Harrison was like, what if you got that ruby? And then he found out about it. He's trying to cover up. Because when Jennings, Big J, goes to read his face, he says, I am certain that he was not hesitant to turn out his pockets. He doesn't say there was no guilt on Harrison's face. He just says he was okay with turning out his pockets. I'm just saying. It's clues like this that keep me on the ball.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even think you're necessarily wrong. Maybe Harrison did say that and the horse was just like, what? Okay.
Harrison told the horse to pick up the ruby?
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's why he didn't want to turn out his pockets.
No, he
because
did.
He had his horse translation guide.
No, but he did want to turn out his pockets. That was the clue that we got, and so I'm basing all my reasoning off that one line, as one should when solving a murder mystery.
Of course.
Yeah, you understand. You see now, it was Harrison the entire time.
But I think you missed the point. Is that these are old multi-breasted pockets, jackets with many pockets. Time. And if he turned out 3 pockets, he still has 18 left in the back.
That's why you got to be thorough.
Exactly.
That's why he couldn't just do it there and then. That'd be rude. He'd be taking out his silverware and there's always little bits of dust and stuff falling everywhere. I'm just saying.
I mean, that's also why these detective stories never actually feature us, really interrogating people because it would take too long to turn out all of these pockets.
It's so much more dramatic just to have the criminal say, I did it, and then they reach into their one pocket and pull out the thing.
It's really, I feel as though fashion brands these days have been coerced into having fewer pockets on our clothing just so it's easier for the police to turn them out when needed.
That's absolutely true. I guarantee there is a law somewhere in some country that says you must have no more than, 5 pockets. It's breaking the law to have that many pockets because that is just too much effort. Too much effort to search.
Yeah, I mean,
it's highly illegal.
If they pick you up by the ankles and shake you out, everything should come out.
That's how it works in the cartoons.
You can't have a pocket that falls into another pocket. That's just cheating.
Dude, that's just too many pockets. Why do you need that many pockets? I'm just saying, just get one big pocket. Much easier.
I see this discussion has clearly gone absolutely off the rails.
That's how it should be.
That's how it should be
That's
for this
how
story.
it should be.
I-
That's what this story is. It's off the rails. It completely comes out of left field. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I really hope that those of you who read along with this story thoroughly enjoyed it. Like, it's obviously old school humor. Like,
Yeah.
it's not a book you're going to be absolutely howling about, but it is silly, and it's fun silly.
Yeah.
Either way, that has been Ruby in the Cauldron.
What's that? Is that what that was?
I mean, it's been the Ruby.
The ruby and the endless
Ruby-
pockets?
I guess
the many pockets?
I would have called this story the Ruby and the Horse, but that would have given things
the
away
Horse.
far too
What
easily.
about Ruby and Jennings, or Ruby and the manor, or the party? The Ruby at the party? I'm just saying. There was a better title in there somewhere.
Jennings Ruby Rube Goldberg machine?
That's the one.
That's
That's
the
it.
one.
Trademark that quick. Or someone steals it. Don't you steal that.
Coming up next on the show, Herds spoke with Anna Fienberg, author of the much beloved children's series Tashi. And then later on in the show, we'll be talking chapter 2 of The House in the Mist. This is Death of the Reader. Stick around.
You're listening to Death of the Reader on 2SCR. This is Flex and Hertz having a chat with children's book author and recently made member of the Order of Australia. I don't know how a budget can support this. Anna Fienberg, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Herds. Nice to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Before we continue, I should mention that I am a longtime fan of the Tashi series. My old babysitter used to come around with a book each week and read them to me when I was a young lad. The first one that I read was Tashi and the Demons, and moving from book to book, seeing how Tashi defeat each of his nemesis with brain over brawn was always very exciting.
Oh, that's lovely to know.
Yeah.
Yes, I think the Demons is one of the scarier ones, and I have had children say to me that that's their favourite, but they're only allowed to read it in the daytime.
It gave me nightmares as a child, so yeah.
Oh dear.
It's okay though. I'm well equipped now to deal with any demons if they should come upon me.
Well, you know the strategies now, you see.
I do.
To deal with them.
It's going to outsmart them, of course, like Tashi.
Yes, because really they're very silly. That's the thing to know.
Of course. Currently, we're covering House in the Mist by Anna Catherine Green. In this story, there are some fairy tale-like elements in the story. Not exactly demons, but I was curious, how have you been inspired by fairy tales in your own writing?
Look, I think a lot of the Tashi stories, and really many stories for children particularly, come from the old fairy tales and the myths and the legends, and there are these larger-than-life archetypal figures that heroes have to battle with, and so they're there, and they're there in our own lives too. So I think particularly with children, people are often nervous about figures that might terrify them, or that might have a deleterious effect that way, but they exist, and so the best way, I think, is not denying that these things exist, but actually, helping supply children with hope and possibilities and courage and strategies, to deal with some of the more negative things in life. So, I've been told that's one of the reasons perhaps that Tashi is so popular, because even though he's a child, he just has to sort of still his mind and use his imagination in order to overcome these figures of horror. And the fact that he can do it, they identify with him being a child and using his wits. So. And every story has a problem. I mean, you cannot have a story without a problem, can you? So why not make it as dramatic as possible?
Are there any particular fairy tales or stories from other cultures? I know that the Baba Yaga, one of the creatures that Tashi has to deal with is from Slavic folklore. Are there any particular stories that excite you? Is it the Baba Yaga, or is there another that you might draw upon?
Yes. Oh, well, and then, stories like the Pied Piper, that was most definitely an inspiration for the magic flute, where there's a locust plague about to descend on Tashi's lands, or the lands of the village, and they're all aghast. What will we do? And it'll all be gone. And then a stranger appears who has this magic flute, and he can make them disappear with a single note. He's promised to. They have to promise that they will give him a bag of gold for his work, and of course that's the wicked Baron. And does he finally pay? As he promised? No. And so the Pied Piper, really the stranger, it begins to lead the children off toward the edge of a cliff as punishment. And wicked Baron has all this time to renege and to finally pay his money, but he won't. And so that whole kind of moral dilemma is explored. I mean, of course, it's exaggerated punishment, and not even for the people who made the decision, but it is explored about whether there was, you could see the Pied Piper's point of view to some degree, and so we can extract a lot of those moral dilemmas from those old fairy tales and myths.
I mean, as you say, there are some quite wicked characters like the Baron or the demons. You're known for writing tales for children, but you also incorporate these terrifying creatures into them. How do you normally go about inserting these horror elements into children's tales? I feel like that'd be somewhat difficult to balance.
Well, there's also quite a bit of horror in real life, isn't there? I mean, there's also the warlord who steals children and, uses them as slaves. And, look, Tashi, he's somebody in his village that is absolutely beset with these sorts of horrors. But I think if you give children enough confidence to know that he is going to be able to deal with it, even though, there's risk and danger and so on. But if you equip your hero with enough nous and courage and wits, then they will feel all the way through. It's as if you're holding their hand through these dangers. And there's something very thrilling about feeling comfortable and quietly confident and yet scared. I think it's quite a complicated but interesting experience that children can have, and also particularly if they're being read to as well. There's a lovely intimacy with sharing those stories and your own emotions about them with a parent or other friends, or but always within the safety of your own reality.
So you've talked a lot about equipping children with these tools, and as I've mentioned, one of your mottos in writing Tashi is about this brains over brawn. This is very small, gnomish character, childlike, one might say, taking on much larger creatures. I was curious, why did you choose to write children's tales? Why did you choose to engage in this genre yourself?
Well, I think I've been writing stories since I was about 8, just little stories. But for my own amusement, I didn't ever actually think I would be a writer. I thought I'd do something else completely different. And I just kept writing. As I read, it was compulsively. I've always read. My mother, Barbara, who ended up co-writing those stories with me, was a teacher librarian who is a marvellous storyteller herself. It never mattered whether we hadn't seen the end of an episode, say a television episode, because if she'd seen it, she'd sit us down and tell us, and as if we were there, But even as a child, she would she would tell and read. She read stories beautifully, did all the voices, and so I was soaked in it. From the very beginning, it was just this. Whatever book we were reading was as important as lunch, in our household, and so it was just a major passion. And you do tend to, I think, writers often are real readers.
Right.
It's using the same equipment, isn't it, of the imagination? Because as you're reading, you make up pictures. It wouldn't mean anything without it. But when you're a writer, you can choose where where you want to go and what pictures you have in your mind, and I liked that. But I don't know that I would have written for children. I was writing adult stories and did a bit of journalism, but then I got a job with the school magazine, which you grew up in New South Wales, did you?
Yes, I did actually, yes.
Yeah, and it was the Department of Education magazine, literary magazine for kids since 1916.
Wow.
It was a very, I think, a very advanced sort of idea. It was about really just trying to associate pleasure with reading, get children to be hooked from early on as a purely pleasurable activity and not allied to curriculum or, anything particular in that sense. And so it was a dream job for me. We used to read about 1,000 books a year to choose the best ones to review, and I really fell in love with kids' stories, and I had to write children's stories then sometimes for the magazine too when there weren't enough manuscripts sent in that were appropriate, and so one of those stories actually was Angus and Robertson, I think, said, it was a series I wrote, could we make that into a book? And it was very exciting. I think that's what made me realise, maybe I could do this, and I sort of went from there.
And you teamed up with a talented artist as well for the Tashi books.
Well, that's the thing, and I think this is why Tashi has become as popular as it is, because of this, 3 people who work on it, and Kim, was the inventor of Tashi in a sense, certainly of the way he looked, because my mother and I had written the first story, which we didn't know was going to be a series. We thought it was going to be one picture book, but we gave him the manuscript, and he went away and went somewhere very quiet as he goes, because that first reading, he says, always they tend to supply the images that will probably endure into the book, and so takes that very seriously, and he didn't say anything for a month, and then he came back with this absolute surprise of a person. I mean, Barbara and I had thought it looked like an ordinary boy who had to sit in a classroom, and tell stories and so on. He would probably be Asian because we wanted to set it in that part of the world where there were, stories of ghosts and ancestors coming back as ghosts and so on, and misty mountains, but here instead was this little elf-like character that Kim drew with the question mark hair and this
I love
Santa Claus suit.
sorry to interrupt. I love the way that Tashi's hair curls back and forth. I can imagine it like flipping in the wind as he's running about, especially with the dancing shoes. That'd be beautiful.
Yeah. Yes, and often, so often the question when I visit school, is that his hat or is it his hair? and I'd say, well, you'd have to ask him because, but he said, well, it's his hair, of course, but he just has to use a lot of product.
He's keeping someone in business, isn't he?
Yeah.
Dear.
But yes, he just. I think the fact that Tashi looked so magical then tended to influence the rest of the books. Somehow we were given license to, really take off into more fantasy land because he just looked like such a special little boy. Yeah.
I mean, I think it was an excellent choice. It's gotten you an induction into the member of the Order of Australia. I have to ask, Anna, did you ever think you'd be in this studio telling us about your induction into this order by the Queen of Britain, or was that something that was on your agenda?
Yes, but such a good Republican as me.
Of course.
But no, I didn't. I think it's wonderful. But I must say it's very grown up. It just seems it's still a bit hard to believe,
It's okay.
but it's a lovely thing because I feel it's a very shared award.
Yes, of
with,
course.
not only the Barbara and Kim, but with children's literature, in general. It's a lovely thing for children's literature to be recognised
Yeah.
with that sort of stature, it's lovely.
I was just going to say, I saw that Hugh Jackman was on the list as well. So having, your lovely little children's books put on the same pedestal as Hugh Jackman, world-renowned heartthrob.
Interesting. Yeah, I saw that too. And and I thought, they haven't told me about the ceremony yet, but I wonder if he'll be there. Because I'll be there.
You could meet him. Did you get to meet him?
Yeah.
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 So I suppose, what advice would you give to aspiring authors in the field on telling compelling stories?
Oh, well, we've got about an hour. No, I'll edit myself as well.
Of course.
I would say read and read and read. I think reading widely, it helps you discover what you like, really, which helps you really, I suppose, know yourself as a person too. And certainly helps you know what you want to write about. Generally, what you want to read about is what you want to write about, and so it also, while you're reading, it's so effortless, but you're learning so much, not only about language and, you're letting yourself fall under that spell of the images being created. Your mind is being fed all the time by possibilities, things you would never have dreamt of, lives you can be living while you're reading. And it's amazing how you unconsciously absorb structure of story and how to create suspense. And, it's a lovely, unconscious, effortless thing to do. But, learning that you don't really have to be alone in your own mind, that other people feel and think things just like you, and even though they might have very different lives, you're all linked. We're inherently very much the same in our inner worlds, and it gives you confidence then to write about those things, I think. So reading a lot and then making notes about what you observe. It's like sort of turning on a little switch in yourself and noticing, being alert to what you are interested in, helping your curiosity build. And when you do hear an interesting conversation, or you have a fascinating dream, or something happens that makes you feel a lot, just make a note of it. Get a notebook and write it down. Doesn't have to be a story then, but later on it might become a story. And it helps you to make that transition. It's not easy, of what you feel and think and actually putting it on the paper. And the more you practice that and the more you do it, the easier it becomes. So you're sort of honouring your experience and your imagination by doing that too, and it just feeds itself that way.
Anna, was there anything else you wanted to? Do you have any upcoming books or projects you'd like to mention on the show before we sign out today?
Yeah, no, I'm writing something at the moment actually that I've been really stuck in, and I'm really interested in the characters still and so on, but I don't quite know what to do with them at the moment. So no, I think I'd be a bit incoherent.
Oh, that's quite all right. It's all right. Well,
about that, but children often ask me, "Are you going to keep writing?" When they hear how old I am, and I say yes. I say it most defiantly.
Keep writing even when you're lying in the bed.
100.
Yeah, I can imagine it. Alrighty. Well, you're listening to Death of the Reader. I'm Hurt, so I'd like to say another big thank you to Anna Fienberg, author of the much beloved Tashi stories, for being on the show today. Thank you, Anna.
Oh, thank you, Hurt. I really enjoyed it.
You're listening to Death of the Reader here on 2SER. We are Flex and Herds, and we've just given you the Rupee Cauldron. But now it's time to return to the titular story of this compendium, The House in the Mist.
The House in the Mist. What a poetic title for a poetic story.
We're
about
dealing
justice.
We're dealing with chapter 2 right now, which, according to the version I have, is 9 pages long.
I think I had 10 pages, but either way, it's very short.
Very short.
Very little happens. Many characters do not do anything during this time, despite the fact that we have 11 of them. We have it nicely counted too in this chapter, which is nice. Yeah. We follow our character, the same hero as last time.
Hugh Austin.
Hugh Austin, and through his adventures, he listens against the wainscoting, which is that little part of the wall that looks different to the rest of it.
Yes.
That's what the
I
wainscoting
do want to
is.
say to you, Herds,
Yeah?
if I was being strict about trying to get you, like, the most story before we, got into the solutions part, I would have ended it halfway through chapter 3.
What? Why didn't you? Are you trying to make things difficult for me?
No, I'm trying to make things easy for the audience so that they don't have to
No.
remember half of a page when our pages on the versions we're reading across the same table are different.
You're not wrong. It's very strange. I mean, even trying to find, copies of this book is next to impossible. My
Yeah.
goodness, it's an old book.
Yeah, there are at least public domain copies available online very
Yes.
easily.
Shout out to Gutenberg, an excellent site that has served us well over the past couple months. Yeah, I really enjoyed this chapter, for as short as it was. I like that you've picked a novel that I can engage with, and coming again to that discussion of, puzzle versus substance, I would say, we're leaning more towards the substance side of things, which I appreciate. We have characters that are acting and having motivations, and not just you could very easily look at a murder mystery as, that's each character is a knife, and is the knife able to kill? Yes, they're the murderer, done. But I like that this chapter, as short as it is, focuses just on the main character and how he's feeling, and how he wants to pursue this Eunice woman and her own morality, how strong she feels about being a good person, which is crazy in this den of villains. I will apologize slightly to Eunice for saying that she might be a horrible murderer. I might be wrong, which is disappointing for me. I did say it would either be a gun or a baby, so I'll take 0.1 of a point. Unfortunately, I didn't really expand upon that other part, but hey, that's fine. There's always next time. Yeah, I like the reveal that she just has a baby with her. No explanation for whose baby it is or where it came from or what's doing there, just that it is a sin. And if that isn't the perfect instruction for a new character, I don't know what is.
Just imagine being raised with that as your tagline.
Yeah, imagine the perspective of this baby. Let's just think about this for a second. You're swaddled up in cloth, so you can't see anything, and then suddenly you're thrown into light. There's all these people you've never seen before. There's sounds, and people are shouting, and everyone's awful. And your mother just says, "I have sinned." What is happening there? I hope that baby doesn't remember any of this, because it's gonna be scarred for life.
I am incredibly fascinated to know what the sin of this child was. What is it that this wealth that Eunice thinks she doesn't deserve? What is the qualification of a child to that wealth?
Oh my goodness! I mean, I don't know, dude. It's tough. It's tough to figure out. The most obvious one, the most straightforward one, that she had a child out of wedlock. I don't know how dark this novel is going to go, but having a child with someone who is in the family might also be a thing. I don't know if that's going to be part of this novel, but that would definitely be a sin. I don't know. Those are the ones that spring to my mind most immediately as being a sin, I suppose.
You don't think she just murdered her husband and that's why she's shown up alone?
But then why did she show the baby? I mean, that could be it. That seems terribly straightforward to me. I think that just by her, unveiling the child and saying, "This is my sin," I think it'd be more fun if there's something up with the child's birth. But that's my thoughts. That's my big dramatic thoughts.
I mean, do you even think we're going to get closure on this?
I mean, judging by the way that we're progressing, we're already halfway through the novel and we have more questions than answers. I mean, the protagonist has set his eyes on her because that's something that male protagonists do. So we're probably going to get some kind of explanation, like, this is why I did this horrible thing or whatever. And it probably won't be that bad, and they'll ride off into the sunset at the end. So that'll be great. The thing that I am more interested in is the fact that because she has extricated herself by, saying, I am not a terrible human being, both of our characters are outside of the room with all the awful people in it. So if anything goes horribly wrong, they're not going to be a part of that. She's gone out the front, he's gone out the back. Whether they, link up afterwards or whatever's going to happen there. I think that this gives us the perfect precedent for something awful to happen to all those villainous characters inside the room. Because any one of them getting away with all the money is just not okay.
At this point, I am really hoping that the next chapter we open on them just, outside, and they're just like, oh, hey, how's it going? And then the doors all open and everyone inside is dead with no explanation.
I hope the house gets set on fire. That's what I want. I want them to be like, yo, what's happening? We should hang out here. Maybe we should go find a horse. And there's like the sound of a match being struck, and then everything goes on fire. That'd be great.
It would be great.
Yeah.
I want to talk about Smeed.
Why? Why Smeed?
Smeed is this character who...
Mr. Smeed.
He was definitely like the least characterized character of chapter 1.
I guess so. He's at least like cartoonish, I suppose.
But now that we've gotten to chapter 2, he's been given, the musical way that he reads, and also the way he drifts between the first person of the will and the third person of him reading it to the others. He's a very animated character relative to anyone else.
And he enjoys his job. He enjoys the misery that he causes in drawing everything out to the nth degree, which is fantastic.
It's so weird because like part of me looks at him and I'm like, he is clearly the villain in this pile of villains because he's not like, I think he's the villain for the same reasons you thought Eunice was.
Yeah.
Where she's given enough characterization to make her suspicion, but not enough to sell her as the villain.
Well, he's certainly the orchestrator of this. I think that...
Really?
Yeah.
You think so? You don't think that Anthony Westenhall has anything to do with this?
If this is because he shows up at the end, is like, I have been puppeteering this with the shadows the entire time, I'm done. I'm out. Get out. Yeah, I don't know. I think that the most obvious thing that's going on here is that Smeed is like, I'm going down, I'm taking you all with me, or he locks the door on them or something like that. In fairy tale stories, which this kind of reminds me of in terms of the way that the characters are portrayed, as you say, very animated. I could imagine this being a cartoon. Usually the villains get their comeuppance, and I would not be surprised in the plan, whether it's Smeed's or Austin's or whoever's it is, that like, if any man has or woman has some kind of sin that they want to admit, they should leave this place and not get all of the thousands of dollars, all of the hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's a test. That's to see if there's anyone who is good enough to actually leave the damn house before something bad happens.
Right. So you think that everyone that's stuck in here is going to have something bad happen to them because they didn't leave?
This is when the demons come out and are like, you have the sin of greed. We will now take you down to hell. That's going to happen. It's going to happen. That's why the mist is here, because there are misty demons out there.
All right.
I can't wait for it.
This sounds absolutely fabulous. This story sounds amazing. I'm so glad that you're reading this story ahead of me, Herd, so that we can.
Dude, I'm just saying, if that's what happens, I'm sold. It'll be the best story. And if it's not, I'm writing that story. I'm writing the story about a house in the mist where all the evil people go, and they're like, "Are you a good person?" They're like, "Yes, absolutely," and then they get killed by demons. That's what happens.
So your solution hasn't really changed terribly much over the past few pages, except for the fact that you think that Eunice is less responsible.
I think that the scope has kind of changed because in my mind, the way this is going to kind of go is that the stakes are not like, do I get the money? It's now like, what happens to Eunice? Do we live happily ever after? Maybe that's where it's going to go. That's certainly what I'm interested in. Yeah, I don't know. I want to see what happens with her. I want to see if she's like secretly evil or if there's a way that she could be redeemed, all that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, the main question that I have is that when I read this chapter, I thought that the unveiling, or rather the asking of the question that, who here has sin, changed my perspective a lot on what was going on, whereas it doesn't seem to have changed it so much for you.
I'd be very curious to hear how it's changed your perspective, because I'm not sure. I'm not sure what's going on there.
Well, I was thinking very much along the same lines as you, as to, this is a kind of supernaturally type story.
Maybe.
And, everyone's been gathered here to be read out the will and be distributed what's here.
To be judged.
But I thought that the asking of sin changed my perspective on what the motive behind everyone being summoned here in this way was. Right?
Okay.
I don't want to say too much for fear of unveiling it ahead of time, but I do think that at least my personal clue for you before you start reading the next couple of chapters right here before the end is think a bit more about that sin. Think about what that question means for the story, because I think one of the things for the way that I approach mysteries is definitely why did the author put this here? And I feel as though the things that you've gleaned from this question could have been kind of gleaned from the last chapter without this addition.
I guess so. I don't know. I read the Ruby and the Cauldron and I was like, maybe the scope is not as large as I was expecting. So I've dialed back my expectations a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that that is definitely in the context of these 3 stories wrapped up in this one book. That is a safe bet to go ahead. I don't want to oversell you and say that it's some grandiose, complex Rube Goldberg
It's going
machine.
to be. This is going to happen. When you get to the next chapter, it's going to be like, it was actually Austin was possessed, or he was the man who died. He's been reincarnated as a younger ghost. And he's coming back to judge people for their sins. It's going to happen.
Yeah. I think the main thing to me is that this line made me think, maybe this isn't supernatural. And that's the thought I will leave you with as far as it goes solving this puzzle.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it will be supernatural at the end. I think that it's probably just going to be that the house is set on fire by Smeed or some nonsense like that. But, yeah, I don't know. I guess we'll see what happens.
Is it real or is it magic?
It's probably not magic. Not in this context, no.
I definitely want to talk about the differences between our expectations and how the story actually turns out next week. So that's what you can look forward to.
Sounds good.
I've had lots of fun reading these stories. Ruby and the Cauldron is definitely still my favorite out of the 2 so far. Maybe the next couple of chapters will salvage my opinion of the House in the Mist.
Oh my goodness. Well, you've read the whole thing.
I have.
You should know by now whether you like it or not.
I'm speaking with the pretense of how I felt when I was at these points, just because I don't want to lead you too much.
I mean, you'll always lead me around. I don't know what's happening more, but
That's true. It's true.
But
Either way, next week we will be back with the Hermit of Street and chapters 3 and 4 of The House in the Mist. I'm looking forward to it.
I'm looking forward to whatever ends up happening. It's gonna be crazy.
Thank you to Paul Meter for the music that's sending us out here. We will see you next time. And that was part 2 of The House in the Mist and Other Stories by Anna Catherine Green.
A nice little breakup of the pace. Talk about the Ruby and the Cauldron. Enjoyed that one.
Yes, a little bit of a fun gaff off into making fun of detectives, which is not something that we do nearly enough of on this show. We need to make fun of more detectives.
Yeah. Moving into part 3, we have the revelation of the mystery behind the House in the Mist. We also have a chat about the Hermit of Street, which is a fun little story about a man on Blank Street who has some mysteries of his own that we had to figure out. Nobody murdered in this one either, which was slightly disappointing.
Yeah, if you ever want to get the inside scoop on what's coming up on Death of the Reader each Sunday, I speak to Jess Clayman on 2SER's Weekend Breakfast about just before 10 on Sydney time, Sunday morning. And I was having an interesting chat with Jess about how this story is kind of a weird blend of, pro-feminist, a woman solving the problems and getting out scot-free, but also this weird, conventional relationship where we don't tell the police about the fact my husband has been keeping people trapped in an attic.
It's very non-politically correct, I think is the term I'm going to use.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a weird little story. It's definitely worth puzzling over breakfast. We also had Dr. Stephanie Russo on the show, an avid crime fiction reader. We spoke about many exciting things, but the most interesting of which was the relation between science fiction and murder mystery fiction.
It's always fun when interviews go off the rails in ways that actually really contribute to the narrative you're trying to weave on these shows. It was really interesting as we were sitting there having the interview, and I was thinking to myself, man, this all sounds like the kind of things that people would say about science fiction, and it was really interesting getting to look at that comparison between our beloved detective stories and the social critiques of science fiction.
Yeah, I hope the spontaneity of the episode really shines through. That was an interview that I was particularly happy with.
This is House in the Mist, the final chapters, and The Hermit of Blank Street on Death of the Reader's extended cut. You're listening to Death of the Reader on 2SER. We are Flex and Herds, and it is time for our final episode on The House in the Mist and other stories.
Heck yeah, I'm ready for this grand mystery that we've been presented before us, and we'll follow the culprit and try and catch them, and there'll be all sorts of strange puzzles.
Yes,
Right?
we are talking to open today The Hermit of Blank Street. And the street, we should say, the street is not named Blank Street. There's literally just a gap in the title.
It's great. I love it. It's such a weird artistic choice.
I do like it.
Yeah, it's like Lemony Snicket and these black pages for the elevator falling. Anyway.
Yes, we'll be talking about The Hermit of Blank Street, and then later on in the show, we'll get back to the final chapters of The House in the Mist. But right now, The Hermit of Blank Street is a very strange story.
It's really hardly a mystery.
It is hardly a mystery.
About a third of it is a mystery, and it's not a terribly complicated one. You barely have enough time to think about the possibilities before the answer is revealed to you. So the mystery is, well, I mean, I could summate the whole plot in about 3 sentences.
Do it.
House gets set on fire. Where did family go? We found family and they're safe now. That's it. That's the plot.
That's
Done.
the whole plot.
Like the mystery is, where did family go? Right?
Yep.
That's a third of those 3 sentences. But we really only have about a minute's worth of reading to ponder on that before we realize, oh, the master of the house is going up to up the stairs for some reason. What could he be doing up there? And then we realize that that's where the family is. And then we go and we talk to them, and there's really not much tension at all.
That's pretty much the whole thing.
Yeah.
I should say, when I was initially researching this story, it was sold to me by several outlets as a, horror mystery story and 2 other more regular mysteries. And I don't know whether that's a piece of misinformation that's been spread because, some review sites are a bit lazy, or whether it's actually like a genuine opinion, because I guess technically it still is a mystery.
Yeah.
Just not for very long.
Yeah. I wonder if that's just to make it more easily digestible. Like in that sense, like when you're branding, a murder mystery author's works, you don't want to be saying there is a horror mystery, a regular mystery, and then something that isn't really a mystery but is only a mystery. Like you don't really want to bore everyone with that. You want
Too
to say,
many words.
There are 3 mysteries in here. Wonder at the magnificent stories within. You don't really want to spend that much time
Absolutely.
worrying about it, especially not in this day and age.
That said, for all of the complaints about it not actually being a mystery, it does still, pose a few of the similar stylistic choices of the manor and the families and what's going on there. So it still definitely feels at home in this collection.
Yeah, and it has like a weird moral story to it, which I'm not sure if I'm 100% on board with, but hey.
Definitely a bit old-fashioned.
Like we find out that Mr. Humphrey Allison, he does have a name.
Yes.
It's mentioned maybe once in the whole heckin' novel, but he has his whole family chapped upstairs, and rather than reporting him to the police, our protagonist, Miss Delight Hunter, who's, again, crazy names, she decides, well, I don't want to lose the man that I love, even though he's held his whole family up here in attic for 5 years. So I'm going to come up with this plan to get them back into his life while also not making him be arrested or commit suicide or anything. And I was just like, why? Why would you go to this much trouble when you could just go to the Bobby around the bend, or the whatever it is in America, the Bobby equivalent, the regular policeman, I guess, whatever, boring. And and just tell them that man has his family trapped in the attic. Go get him out.
I mean, I guess one of the main things with this story is that, as the title might suggest, the location is rather inconsequential. Like, it's formally set in New York, but nothing about New York happens.
Is it set in New York? You know what? I was picturing like 2 country houses the whole time I was reading this. I don't remember anything being said about traffic or the bustling streets or whatever. I guess it was a long time ago. Maybe there were less streets.
Our two locations are the town that Delight is from, which we only ever hear of in mention, and the 2 houses of the Van Dykes and Mr. Humphrey.
Oh my goodness, the Van Dykes. Isn't that a beard? Isn't that like a beard style? Isn't that what that is? I know that name from somewhere.
I mean, I think you're right.
Oh my goodness.
Let me just jog over to the beards.
Is that the twist? The beard wall, go grab one and see what it looks like. Dude.
I mean, given all of the very literal names that some of these people have, such as, for example, the captured character being called Ransom.
Oh my goodness.
It actually isn't that far-fetched.
It's such a strange contrast in that we have these characters named Ransom and Delight, very clearly wearing their motivations on their sleeves there. But we also have this narrative of being stuck in an attic for 5 years, which isn't actually played that menacingly in the novel. It's portrayed as a crime, but we don't really it's actually not too terrible for the characters, apparently, according to the author, which is strange.
Even when Delight goes like, "Oh, hey, I'll help you get out of here," the mother of the young daughter is like, that might be a bit difficult for my daughter because she's been shut in for so long. And it's like, what?
She's never seen the sun, and, we just want to give her a couple more weeks before we do that. What are you doing? Get out! Leave! I do not understand what's happening.
It's very strange. I will say, though, I did enjoy this story as a 5-minute, over breakfast kind of story.
Yeah, it's good.
It's written as though it's very serious. It reads a little bit silly, and I wonder if that's just because it's dated.
I don't know. I feel like it has to be, because it doesn't seem... Well, there are some moments that seem self-aware, like when the characters actually call out the fact that the decisions that the protagonist's making to marry a man that she just met because his house was on fire, it points out that's kind of silly. There's a bit of...
It doesn't have the same feel of self-awareness that the Ruby and the Cauldron did, which is also in this collection.
Yes. That novel is much more, I would say, cleverly written. Not that we're a critic show by any means, but if we were, Ruby and the Cauldron gets a higher mark, so it gets an A-, whereas this gets a B+.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that this story is interesting. I do think that if you were to sit down over breakfast and go, oh goodness, how's she going to get out of this one? It kind of takes you on a bit of a round the bend ride. You don't know exactly how things are going to unfold because none of the choices in the book are particularly sensible.
No.
And that it's one of those stories that if a sensible choice was made, it wouldn't be a very interesting story. And that's just kind of something you have to accept with a lot of stories.
It would just end. Like the decision to hold some salad dressing around your waist.
What?
I believe in the novel
you mean
we're told.
When she steals the key?
No. I'm talking about the vinaigrette, which Mr. Light Hunter happens to have around her waist at her side, and she hides the bead and the bit of paper in her salad dressing.
Yes. Okay. So I should explain to you, Herds. I don't know if you actually looked into this. I had to
tell me.
I spent far too much time looking into this. Apparently, a vinaigrette is an obsolete term for a small perforated aromatics pouch. Now, a vinaigrette is actually what was contained in these pouches, but it became colloquialized as the pouch itself. Which is now just salad dressing.
Now it's just salad dressing. I think this story is much better contextualized as just a little jar of salad dressing. She's got a boop, and she's bopped the little bead into the salad dressing, and she's just taken it home. Put it in the fridge. There it goes. Nice and safe and sound.
I did like the way that the story, it didn't necessarily glaze over the characters. It gave them all enough personality that you felt like they were actually there, but also didn't spend too much time on them because it also wouldn't have had the time. The story would have been actually twice as long as if we gave a single character description.
The novel is technically 6 chapters long. However, one of the chapters is 4 lines. So it doesn't really have time to do anything with its characters other than set up a conflict, move it along, have the resolution, the daughter's happy, we're happy, someone almost commits suicide, and bing, bang, boom, we're at the end. Right?
Now, I suppose one of the things we normally address when we finish a story like this is it fair? How does one even answer that question with this story?
I when I was reading it, I was like, oh, he's killed them, clearly, or he's ranted them off to someone.
I guess you don't get any points for this story, then.
I guess not. I wasn't going to get them anyway. I never get points. But it was fine. It was an enjoyable romp. It wasn't completely out of left field, right? They're in the attic. Okay, good. That's something that I can understand. There were no space pirates, for example.
Were you expecting space pirates?
Maybe. That'd be a pretty great twist.
Just the entire house takes off from the streets of New York.
Dude, it's but with space pirates. Oh, it's it.
At that point, you're just describing Treasure Planet, but with a
Guys, 1 week we have to watch Treasure Planet and then just talk about it.
Talk about the mystery?
The mystery
deep
of Treasure
involved
Planet.
mystery
I
of-
don't know what the mystery is, especially since
I
it's
know what
based
the
off
mystery is.
What is the mystery?
I'll have to
It's
tell you
based
when
off
you're
of
older.
Treasure Island, which we already have all seen and loved.
Have we?
Well, I've watched Muppet Treasure Island, which is a superior adaptation.
Right, I see.
And story just flat out. Muppet Treasure Island is fantastic.
That's right. I'll tell you when you're
Anyway,
older.
we haven't done any musicals yet. We have to do one. We have to do a murder mystery musical at Triple M, if you might say.
We're not allowed to say that in Sydney. That's another radio station.
Okay, we'll call it something else then.
I suppose the other thing to address, which I did touch on earlier, was the collection itself. Like, obviously, I said that this doesn't feel out of place in the collection.
Yeah.
And even though I do feel a bit cheated by the fact that I was told this was going to be 3 mystery stories, I did read through before and make sure that this was something I'd be happy having on the show. And, like, there were enough mystery elements in this collection that I thought it was worth having, and talking a bit about different kinds of mysteries and how you can have a story that has a puzzle without a detective or without a perspective that's trying to solve it as we go along. And I don't want to say whether this story and the collection that it's in is a particularly strong example one way or the other, but I do think that if you're reading along with other detective stories and you're going like, this is a bit too cerebral, there are these stories out there which are similar, have, similar tones, have similar feels, tackle similar issues, but don't have that, mathematical, here's where this person was at this time, here's where this person was at this time. So, it's something similar out there for you if you're not into detective stories.
There is no train puzzle, thankfully. Yeah, I really enjoy that we have this scope of murder mystery fiction, or rather mystery fiction in general, where we can have these incredibly complicated stories that are written by 10 or so writers at a time. And then we can also have these little short stories that you read over the span of about 10 to 20 minutes, and you're done. You learn a little moral about, looking after your husband that you just met by exposing his crimes, but not really. And then we go on with our lives. There are murder mysteries that are branded for people who want to spend a lot of time thinking about them and staying up late, but that isn't for everyone, and that's okay. I can enjoy a murder mystery story like this or a detective story like this just as much as I would any other one. Just a matter of investment, I suppose.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I find fascinating about these stories is, given how short their length is and how much I think they're able to fit into that time, how murder mystery TV shows do the same in what is effectively the same amount of time.
Yeah.
Like, I think these stories are closer to the kind of things you'd get from a television adaptation than you would the full logic puzzle breadth of a conventional detective mystery.
Yeah. All that we'd have to do with these stories is give them all the same detective, which wouldn't be too terrible, mind you, and we'd have a serialized set of stories about this one detective who goes from case to case. I actually think that'd be very easy to do, actually, now that I think about it. Yeah, I mean, those sorts of stories, or those sorts of epics that go from story to story and tale to tale, are often the detectives that stay with us, like Sherlock Holmes, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, even when I look at the long-running television series from the UK of Poirot and Miss Marple, those adapted full books into half-hour to hour-long episodes, and I think that in terms of doing justice to the source material, those are maybe some of the ones that get closest to the original text. And reading stories like these, like Anna Catherine Green's short stories here, makes me so much more impressed with the people that go through and adapt those things for television. We spoke a few weeks ago with Andrew Fallon about, adapting murder mystery for stage, and he said that it was a lot more difficult for television because you have so many more things that have to be on screen. And I think that these stories kind of exemplify that in written form. Either way, that was The Hermit of Blank Street.
Excellent.
A strange story indeed.
A very weird one. I don't know if I'm better off, if my life has been richer for having read it or not.
I reckon you are. I reckon you're better off.
I don't know if that's true, but it was a very short story. It was the epitome of a short story. It was perfect. Just the way it is.
All right. This is Death of the Reader. Stick around.
You're listening to Death of the Reader on 2SCR. This is Flex and Herds having a chat with Dr. Stephanie Russo, a lecturer at Macquarie University. Stephanie, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Today we'll be covering the finale of House in the Mist, authored by Anna Catherine Green. Stephanie, I know you have a vested interest in novels as old as the 18th century. Could you tell us why readers should pay attention to novels that outdate us by entire generations?
Because why wouldn't you? Because history is interesting, and I think that in order to understand where we are today with murder mysteries, with crime fiction, with detective fiction, it's really important to look back at the history of the genre. I think that some oddnesses around the structure and form of crime fiction, and as well as the preoccupations of crime fiction, are really much more understandable if you go back to the kind of origins of the genre. And I'm really interested in the origins of the genre in the Gothic mode, because that's where we really see crime fiction come from. It develops out of the Gothic that was really a huge genre in the 18th century. So that's when you get an interest in things like haunted houses and murders and evil and craziness and all of these kinds of themes that we now see manifested in crime fiction.
You're speaking from an academic perspective. What sorts of value do academics get in comparison with regular readers, what they would find reading back and through history?
I don't think that there's anything necessarily different. I think that you can understand these texts from a non-academic perspective as well as you can from an academic perspective. I guess that what an academic kind of brings to a reading of crime fiction is an awareness of that historical context, I suppose, is an awareness of the prehistory of those sorts of themes and where they come from. You know, I read a novel, I might read a crime fiction novel now, and I might think about, Anne Radcliffe, or I might think about Edgar Allan Poe, or I might think about Agatha Christie, and that kind of deepens your appreciation, I think, of the genre. But I don't think that you're necessarily missing anything as a non-academic reader. It's just perhaps giving it texture, maybe giving the reading a bit of texture.
I think one thing that stands out to me through all of these genres, particularly with the Gothic modes that you're talking about, is when I think of authors like Edgar Allan Poe, I think more of the atmosphere and the tone and the setting, whereas when it comes to murder mysteries, I'm thinking puzzles, I'm thinking intrigue. Why is it, do you think, that these different approaches to stories are reflected differently in people's minds in terms of the visuals versus the content?
I suppose there's a bit of a break in crime fiction. In the 19th century, you get the kind of atmospherics that, again, you said were associated with somebody like Edgar Allan Poe. That's certainly true. But then when you get to the golden age of crime fiction and you talk more about your Agatha Christie's, your Dorothy Sayers, people like that who are writing sort of classic puzzles, I think that's when you get a kind of tonal shift into that more concentration on the puzzle aspect. That's not to say that there's not a kind of atmospherics involved in that sort of writing, but you get more of a classic puzzle structure in the more golden age of crime novels as compared to the earlier stuff. I think you also get that tone carry through in some of the noir novels that we associate with the American crime writers of that kind of golden age of crime. So you're thinking about your Raymond Chandlers, your Dashiell Hammetts and so forth. I think that those two things aren't necessarily, atmospherics and puzzles, aren't necessarily as far apart, though. I think that in recent years, with the rise of, say, local crimes, by local crime novels I mean things like Nordic noir, Australian crime, Tartan noir, which is Scottish crime, or Irish crime, you get the marriage of those two things, the puzzle and the atmosphere, because those novels, I'm thinking of people like, say, Nordic noir, people like Camilla Lackberg. She has a strong sense of atmosphere and place in her novels. The Australian novelists like Jane Harper and so forth, they have that emphasis on both aspects, I think. So I think that's that kind of that twin kind of road of crime fiction are coming back together.
There are a large number of female authors. You've mentioned a couple, Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, the Four Queens of Crime. Why are there so many prominent female authors that stand out in that genre? Is there something to that?
I think that it was a genre that women could enter into because it was a genre that was associated with, I suppose, genre, as in genre, not literary fiction. So it was seen as something that women could write, perhaps. I think that women are naturally kind of drawn to these topics. If you look at, there's a lot of discussion these days about women and true crime and why women like reading true crime. because it gives you a sense of management over these kinds of issues. So I think there is a kind of long history of women being drawn to thinking about and writing about criminality and so forth. So I think it was a genre that women could kind of smuggle subversive messages or subversive critiques of the social world into their novels quite easily and without kind of really making it apparent what they were doing. So I think it was a nice kind of way for women to enter into the world of literature in a sort of safe way, if that makes sense, even though we are talking about crime.
I know we were speaking previously with Catherine Lumby from Macquarie here about how true crime and, serial killer fiction and all of those sorts of things can be very cathartic and escapist for many people. How do you think, different audience demographics respond to those sorts of aspects in crime and crime fiction?
Well, I think a lot of people, and I think this cuts across all demographic groups really, are interested in both the exploration of crime as well as the safety of the crime fiction, because that's the kind of safe out that crime fiction gives you, right? You're reading about all these terrible things that happen to people. Somebody once said to me that, why are you reading all of this crime? It's about people on the worst day of their lives, But the thing is with crime fiction, you know that this is the most terrible thing that's ever going to happen to somebody, but you also have the knowledge that it will be solved. Now, some crime fictions don't solve the crime, but they're still in the minority. Most crime fictions, at the end that the crime is going to be solved. So it gives you that chance to kind of dabble with the darker side, I suppose, of humanity and the worst possible things that human beings are capable of, but also that knowledge that order is going to be restored at the end. The bad guy's going to go to jail. The victim will still be dead, but at least there'll be some kind of closure for the family. I think women are particularly, as I said, drawn to those sorts of stories. We see a lot of women involved with true crime at the moment in terms of writing true crime stories, and especially thinking about women's place in true crime narratives. So I think there is a kind of added dimension there for women looking to kind of negotiate the world and think about the world as a particularly dangerous place for women. And I think with crime fiction and its consumption by women, a lot of women are drawn to crime as a way of kind of avoiding crime. If I do X, Y, and Z, I will not be murdered. I will not be in danger. Now, of course, we know that the world doesn't work like that. It doesn't matter what you do. And that kind of creeps rather uncomfortably into victim blaming at times. But I think that subconsciously perhaps women are drawn to stories of crime because if they think, I know what circumstances crime happens in, therefore I will not be a victim.
Yeah, I think that draws an interesting parallel to the story we're covering alongside this, The House in the Mist, and particularly the story, The Hermit of Blank Street, in this case, where the protagonist of the story manages to escape and everyone gets out completely fine because she followed the perfect strategy that made sure everyone got out alive.
Yeah, and that is something that fiction can do, and that can make us feel really, I suppose, settled at the end of a crime story. But of course, we know that real life doesn't work out like that. And I think that we see that in cozy crime. Even, the notion of crime being cozy is kind of oxymoronic. Crime isn't cozy, but we can get that feeling of coziness, of comfort from something like an Agatha Christie, even though we know that in the real world, things aren't like that. It doesn't reflect real life crimes. And I think that's why we read them. I feel very calm when I read Agatha Christie, even though I'm reading about, poisonings, deaths, murders, all these sorts of things.
You mentioned the concept of Gothic modes earlier on. How is crime fiction a reflection or a representation of the development of Gothic modes?
So the Gothic is this kind of almost a blanket genre that sits on top of all of these genres that have come out of it. And when you look at the development of crime, it's a kind of offshoot of Gothic. So if you think about somebody like Edgar Allan Poe, who we've already mentioned, he's writing Gothic fiction in the mid-19th century, and he writes The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is one of the first crime stories, okay? And that has a detective in it it's one of the first detective fictions. And so then you get, coming out of that, people like Arthur Conan Doyle with his Sherlock Holmes stories, which again reflect Gothic kind of modes of writing. But as well are moving towards more that puzzle kind of crime fiction that we've talked about. So if you think about The Hound of the Baskervilles, that's got all of your stereotypical conventions that you associate with Gothic. It's got a big house in the country, it's dark, It's cold. It's mysterious. What is happening? There seems to be a family, that there's something, not quite right about. That focus on the domestic space is, somewhat dangerous, somewhat disordered. But then you also get Sherlock Holmes coming in, and he's going to fix it, and he's going to solve the problem. So you can see how the Gothic and crime are connected, because the Gothic is all about, darkness and crimes and murders and deaths and things that go bump in the night, so to speak. The thing that crime does is allow that to be kind of addressed, or give it a mechanism for potential resolution, perhaps, and to, provide some kind of catharsis maybe for the reader, because they know that these sort of dark happenings are going to be addressed or solved. And remember, this is the time too when we have the development of the police force. So we have people who are really being detectives. And so that interest, I suppose, in the detective novel in the 19th century is really reflecting what's going on in the world. There are a lot of big crime cases in the 19th century that people were very, very interested in. And so the Gothic really transmutes into crime. It becomes its own kind of beast, and it becomes what we now know today as crime fiction. But you can see its roots there in the Gothic that I think is really interesting. And if you consider, I think, crime writing as a kind of historical phenomenon, it becomes deeper and richer in your reading.
Yeah. You mentioned the development of police force and this prominence of actual crime being publicized and sensationalized even. It's curious to see how crime fiction writing almost reflects that cultural change and that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's easy to write off crime. It's formulaic. It's all about, the puzzle. It's not, about characterization, or it's not about, deeper concerns. But if you think about it, crime is a nice way of kind of articulating what's wrong with society. It's a way of pushing at social ills. It's looking at things like domestic violence, violence within families, violence within the home. It could also be about, violence out on the streets. But it's actually getting at a lot of kind of social issues and concerns, right? So if you think about, again, to use the example of The Dry, the Australian crime novel that became really big a couple of years ago, that's all about violence related actually to drought, violence related perhaps to climate change, violence within the family, right? So crime is reflecting, it's not just, fun for the, can I figure out the murderer kind of aspect, but it's about crime in the social world and figuring out how crime and crime fiction reflects the kind of problems of the social world. And I think that's fascinating. Crime is a reflection of climate change, because that's really what we're going to have to grapple with, as the environment dries out and we have these droughts. How might that lead to social unrest? How might that lead to poverty? How might that lead to anxiety that manifests themselves in crime? So crime is always much deeper than people, really give it credit for. People tend to write it off as kind of, escapist reading. But in fact, it can tell you a lot about what's going on, I think, in the broader social world.
Yeah, I do find that interesting, particularly when we look at something like science fiction, which is often credited as like one of the main genres that does social critiques, like those sorts of things on climate change and social injustice. But then when we compare science fiction and crime fiction, they're kind of very separate genres, because a lot of crime fiction is founded on, fairness and understanding and something that is plausible, whereas science fiction is anything but. Do you think that those two genres have parallels or ways that they interlink with their critiques of social spaces, or is that entirely separate approaches?
No, I think that's really interesting. That's a great question. I think that they're, that's not something I've really thought about before, but as you were saying that, I think they are actually closer than they appear, because they're both using the kind of mechanisms of genre to think through things like what is possible, right? What is a problem in the social world or the social landscape? What could we do to prevent that problem or think through that problem from a new angle? And crime, it likes to present itself, and I think sometimes can be quite realistic, but it also can be not realistic in many ways. I was thinking about the crime show The Bridge, the Swedish-Danish version of The Bridge. It's been subsequently remade into many different things in many different countries. But I was teaching that this semester, and I was talking about it with my students, and we all realised how ridiculous the storyline is. Now, I love the show. I think it's fantastic, but it features a murderer who has the most convoluted plot, right? And, uses the media in this way that is almost clownish, really, if you think about it kind of from a would this actually happen perspective. So in many ways, I don't see them as I'm talking, I'm realising that they're not actually so different. Most crimes, if you speak to police and detectives and prosecutors and lawyers and so forth, they'll tell you most crimes are really prosaic. Most crimes occur within families. The victim and the perpetrator are known to each other. Mostly they get caught straight away because these kind of evil geniuses don't really exist. We have this idea of the murderer as like this Jack the Ripper genius kind of person who is, so good at evading justice. But in fact, most people who are murdered by somebody close to them, and it's usually very apparent who's murdered them almost immediately. It's only those outlier cases where there's any sort of mystery around it. So in a way, they're almost science fiction.
Yeah.
It
does remind me, now that you mentioned the bridge, there's a variety of like Scandinavian thrillers that kind of bridge that gap between sci-fi and crime, where we have like, the mysterious alien thing that's landed in this small town that's causing everyone to go crazy and commit crime. Like that's definitely I wouldn't call it a trope, but it's something I've seen more than once. So that's definitely an interesting way to kind of put a bridge between those two genres.
And often,
pun intended.
That was awful.
I didn't even get the pun at first, but yeah, I agree that was awful. No.
Thank you. Somebody has to agree with me on the show.
But I mean, a lot of science fiction also too has crimes in it, right? Or there's a kind of central kind of mystery as well. Yeah. I mean, even if you go back to thinking about things like, I don't know, Star Wars.
Yeah.
There's crimes, there's murders, there's things that need to be avenged. So I think that they're actually much closer than perhaps people think about. And certainly something I hadn't thought about before this, so thank you.
Yeah, it's very interesting to think about the concept that a lot of, I would call highbrow science fiction, Star Trek comes to mind. Shout out to Star Trek. The mystery is not necessarily crime itself, but exploring a new planet, exploring a new civilization, learning things about humanity through the way that we interact with them. There's this mystery going on that the characters have to kind of work their way through with science, with puzzle-solving abilities, one might call it, which is something that all murder mystery, most murder mystery seems to break down to anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, you get a lot of science in crime fiction. We have the craze for forensic science, right? The idea that that is often perpetrated on television, which doesn't at all again reflect reality. That you'll look at this bone, as in the show Bones, and you'll be able to tell everything about the crime. And I don't know if you've seen, there's been a bit of unrest in the legal community about those sorts of shows because, the jury will end up on the stand and they'll say, but where's the forensics? And they'll say, that's just on TV, sorry. Science hasn't really gone to the places that we imagine it's gone to in crime fiction. So there is this marriage of science and crime. But I think, too, that quest to find something new, the quest to figure it out, the quest to come up with some kind of definitive answer is common to science fiction and crime. We want to know the answer.
Yeah.
We want to figure out what happened. We want to reconstruct stories. And I think that's, again, another kind of resonance between the two genres.
You're listening to Death of the Reader. This is Flex and Herds with Dr. Stephanie Russo. Thank you for joining us today.
No worries. Happy to talk about crime anytime.
We are talking House of the Mist, and we'll be back in just a second. You're listening to Death of the Reader on 2SER, and we're here for the final drink of the House in the Mist, the final draft.
These are all terrible puns. Why am I even here?
I know.
Flex, what are you doing to me, having me in this room, telling me about drinking and how tough it is to swallow the truth sometimes of the grand mystery.
We are chatting the last two chapters of The House in the Mist and the story as a whole and how fair it was, as we often do with these murder mysteries. And I love it. I love this story.
It was very fun. It was not quite as ridiculous as I had hoped, but it was getting there. It was definitely just within the bounds of realism, but it was still completely off the walls bananas by the end, which is great.
I think when I got to the beginning of chapter 3, I so badly wanted it to just go violently supernatural, as we'd been hinting at in the past 2 weeks.
Humans and vampires.
But I think that what was actually written here was so compelling that it didn't matter to me that that's not what I got.
Yeah. the way that the novel, especially in the last 2 chapters, delivers its gut punch that all the characters who assembled here have killed Uncle Anthony previously, and that they're all getting their comeuppance. The way that we are presented that is so beautifully done, despite only being, 20 minutes of reading, something like that. Maybe a little bit more.
The line I initially wanted to finish on, if we had decided to go halfway through chapter 3, was the bottle from which your glasses are to be replenished for this final draft, he has himself provided.
Andrew Popel? Is he here? Is he serving drinks?
No.
I feel like if we ever meet Andrew Popel again, don't take his drinks. He's trying to poison us.
That's a wise idea.
He's given us that little glass bottle and it's got the skull on the outside. You know the one.
I know the one.
You've seen those cartoons. You don't drink from those.
Final Draft is on Saturday mornings on 2SER if you wanted to check out Andrew's work, other literature shows on the station. But I really loved how this story built up to that moment. The way that we got clues that, everyone was guilty and you could leave if you felt like you were, resigned to your guilt. And the fact that Smeed won't ever touch the food.
Yes. I will say one of the clues, I will contest the fairness of this murder mystery bit. I don't know if I get points or not. You can tell me, I guess. I probably won't. But the one clue that I was really frustrated that I missed was when Smeed, he goes on and on and on about welcome everybody, and then they're like, who's this new guy? And he's like, hello, I'm just someone who's wandered in out of nowhere. And he says, all right, you need to go outside, but don't touch the food. The food is for us. You cannot eat the food because it's poisoned. That's why he doesn't want to eat the food, as one of the clues that I missed on my first read through, and I was very sad.
Yeah, I do think this story is fair in what it asks for you to solve, which is not very much. We don't have a detective, we don't have a corpse, we don't have...
none of it is on screen. It was, sort of. The murder of the uncle has happened in the past somewhere else. We have the portrait as the proverbial corpse, but we don't really have any death on screen until it's all resolved. The mystery is, in a way, what is going to happen to these characters. Spoilers, they all die, except for the good ones, because we got to have a moral in there somewhere. And the moral is to own up to your sin. I think.
I really did love the moment when Hugh Austen was like, this is going too far. I'm going to step out of this cupboard that I'm watching this all from and show myself to everyone. And everyone was just so distraught at that point that no one noticed him.
That's beautiful. I like that moment. It tells us more about Hugh Austen as a character than I think the entire novel, where he's pulled upon by impulse and emotion to eject himself out into the open to see what the heckaroon is going on.
Yeah.
And that's actually something that we see, like, he's not a compelling character most of the time, but he is consistent. He is consistently pushed by his emotion. He's pushed to seek shelter from the the mists and the dreariness outside. But then he's enraptured by Eunice, and he's pulled at the end by this great desire to know what on earth is going on, right? To see everything clearly, which I think also is shared by the reader in that moment. It's it's very well played.
That's definitely why Hugh Austen works so well as a reader perspective, because he has that desire to know more. And it's not the kind of story that will ever tell you, like, hey, you should be thinking about and solving this, like a lot of detective mysteries do. Yeah. But Hugh Austen creates that desire for you.
Yeah. He's not a detective in the sense that he doesn't investigate things and pick up on clues. He's like a sponge. He just kind of soaks up what's happening around him, and then he bursts right at the end. Yeah. And then everybody's dying. So
I think that the two core mysteries of this story are what happened to Anthony Westenhor and what is going to happen. And those are both questions that Hugh Austen, searches for. He tries to find the answers for. And I think that the way that he goes about that, where he's listening at boards of the walls, where he's spying in on meetings, where he's, thinking to himself, well, geez, who are all these evil people? Why are they so evil?
They're evil.
Yeah.
They are sinful creatures.
It's really excellent. And I think that basically the challenge in this story is, can you figure out that they killed Anthony Westenhor before the letter mentions it? And can you figure out that Anthony Westenhor intends to poison before the fact that the bottle is green and marked just like this one is mentioned?
Yeah, the big skull. That was the giveaway. At that moment, you figure it all out. You know exactly what's going on. Yeah, I actually really enjoy the way that this novel tackles sin as a concept, which is kind of a lofty, sin. It's bad things that we do. But the way that Anna Catherine Green approaches this in a similar way to Emile does, where the sort of savior of the good guys is that they are flawed. They are pure to a fault, right? Eunice is so not sinless that she says, I have done one bad thing. Like I kicked a puppy once, or maybe not kicked a puppy. Maybe that's too far for Eunice, but I did something bad, and so therefore I cannot partake of the inheritance. There's this assumption on the part in the story of Anthony that only the characters who are truly sinful will not leave the room. They will be so embedded in their own sin that they won't want to give up the money for that requirement, which I think is really clever. And it also reinforces that narrative that it is the sinless ones who get away at the end. It's the characters who do the right thing, uphold the moral codes of society, et cetera, et cetera. They're the ones who don't get poisoned and make it away with a baby. So that's good.
Yeah, I mean, to my mind, I think that Eunice's sin was probably that she had like a child out of wedlock or something.
Yeah.
And the idea being that her reward, as well as the finances for, leaving and saying I'm guilty, was also that here you've, at the whims of me, Anna Catherine Green, the author, you have met the man that will now become your family.
Yes, this is one of those old-timey romance things, and maybe even current-timey romance things in certain circles where you're rewarded with a romantic interest, affection for doing the right thing. Which is, one of those finicky little parts of romance novels. Not 100% behind, but it's definitely a part of this story. The characters who are good and righteous are rewarded by probably getting married at the end and running off into the sunset or into the mist, I guess.
I did also love that line where Smead just appears at the end and he's like, well, I guess you get the money.
Yeah. Because why not? Someone's going to have it. What's he going to do? Sit there and collect dust? I mean, here's the thing. If he was truly a sinful character, he would just run off with the money himself. But he is a solidly neutral character, which I really love. I like that Smead is not... Like, I thought for a second he was going to get torn apart by the cousins, but he doesn't. He makes it out.
I mean, I thought that he was being when I first read it through.
Yes, same. But he makes it out, thankfully, because they all die before they can kill him.
Yeah, I did want to drag us back to the start of chapter 3 here and talk a bit about the country house murder. We've obviously had this concept kind of loosely touched on a few times in the show where, a lot of murder mysteries happen where you arrive at a country house and the only people that are there and no one else is involved and a murder happens. And this story not only breaks those bounds, as we mentioned earlier, by the fact that there is no corpse, but also that at the beginning of chapter 3, having everyone locked inside, the first thing that happens is Hugh Austen's just like, all right, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
I think that it's not necessarily a particularly clever addition or subtraction from the puzzle in one way or another, but I do like the way that it eases you out of that mysterious enclosure of the house, because obviously it starts to broaden up and then they leave at the end and we're trying to dissuade from the supernatural there. I think that opening to chapter 3 was a very good tone setter for how the rest of the story went, and considering how simple that detail is, I like how effective it felt to me.
Yeah, symbolically it pulls Hugh Austen and Eunice and the child, it pulls us out of the consequences of the moment. It means that then when we return and we see the cousins fighting, we are outside of this. We are pulled out from the moment. We are no longer a part of this conflict, even though we'll benefit from it at the end. But for that conversation, for Smead's big evil villain speech, which he gets despite not being the big evil villain and whatever's going on there, which is great. There's all sorts of morality nonsense going on there. Smead gets this wonderful moment where he just gets to tell the cousins everything and completely throw them under the bus and kill them. But yeah, we get this beautiful moment where we symbolically have said, Smead is a neutral party. These are our heroes. They are physically separated from the rest of the group by walls of the country house, right? Which is, it's part of... these characters are isolated from the rest of the world, and then we, the protagonists, are even further isolated from that out in the shed. We're given our own little space to kind of dwell in, and we don't care about, in that moment in chapter 3, we don't actually care about what's going on in the house. We are presented with a much more immediate concern of feeding the child, which Eunice has wrapped in her arms. it ceases to be a murder mystery for those pages. It becomes almost like a survival story.
Yeah.
How do we get the food? And in my mind, I was thinking, is this when we follow the like sneaking into the house and taking the bread and and then we get spotted and then there's this whole other thing going on. But yeah, it's a very strange, not quite genre shift. It doesn't completely take us out of the scene, but it's a good way of putting walls up between our characters.
Yeah, I did want to touch on what you said there about Smead and his evil villain speech.
Go for it.
I do love that Smead is given the evil villain speech as the lawyer and then ends up being relatively innocent towards the end. I almost wonder if that's Anna Catherine Green making commentary on the practice of law.
Maybe.
The idea that they're often seen as the villain in many cases, but they're doing it because it's a job.
Yeah. I mean, he's just doing his job. He's getting paid. He's doing what Uncle Anthony wanted. He even exclaims as much as he's being, attacked.
Yeah.
He says, I didn't know there was poison in the food, which, I mean, how would you have set that up otherwise? I guess there was the man who left the house at the beginning of the story who we don't seem to have an identity for.
Yeah.
Which I will say, because that just occurred to me, that is a beautiful little thread that could easily be taken and turned into a series of novels, right?
I was very much expecting that man to come back at some point in the story, but we never even find out who he is.
If that was Anthony or somebody else who is, the exactor of vengeance.
It's because the one thing that could still be supernatural in the story.
Maybe. Because, if Smead is telling the truth, and by the law of morality in this novel, it seems that he is, because he isn't punished at the end for murder or anything. It would seem that gentleman at the start is the person who poisoned the food. I could very easily see Anna Catherine Green taking that concept of a character who just, carries out vengeance on murder victims and turning that into a series. That'd be perfect,
I
actually.
almost feel like that's the kind of character that's maybe just going to show up in one of Anna Catherine Green's later novels as like, oh yeah, and there's this guy who was arrested for being a serial murderer going around and leaving poison for people.
This is like apple pie around.
Yeah.
Ooh, delicious apple pie on the windowsill. Oops, something's wrong with me chest. I don't know why I went a little bit Irish there. But anyway, I'd love a recurring character like that. And I think, honestly, that's what really cements a lot of murder mystery fiction in my mind, is when we have those really recognizable detectives and characters and villains. Like we have Sherlock and Moriarty, obviously, and Watson, lest we forget. And
how dare you?
I would never forget the Watson, okay? We have Lecoq, we have all sorts of characters who come back novel after novel after novel, and we get attached to them and we see them grow and we see them solve, we have an expectation of how they're going to solve the crime and they subvert those expectations. I feel like having these short stories would be an excellent way to introduce those sorts of characters, having a through line through all these adventures of this strange man in the bowler hat and the cane, and he shows up and he puts poison in people's food. That'd be great.
I mean, as we covered in the LaRouche case, that's basically how Monsieur Lecoq, Emile Gaboriau's most famous detective, was introduced as a side character.
Yep. And that sort of thing is always fun to watch. Watching the writer realize, this is a character I'm going to stick with. This is how I develop them. And it means you just have a lot more time to get to know them, I suppose. Yeah.
I think the other thing that we touched on earlier that I really wanted to praise this book for was just the volume of brilliant one-liners. Like, there's nothing particularly quotable here, but there are so many lines that sum up everything that's going on in single lines. Like when one of the cousins, who unnamed, says, "I'll drink to Uncle Anthony out of that bottle until there isn't a drop left to tell what was in it." Like, a few moments before telling you what all of them did to Uncle Anthony, here's a summary of what they did in one sentence about a wine bottle. It's excellent.
It's perfect. And I love that we don't know who said it. It could be any of them. It could be all of them.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like that line is intended to almost express everyone's sentiments in the room. We are all going to drink, but we're not going to think about it. We're just going to keep going with our lives and get super drunk, and then we're all dead. And that's the end. And then there's a room full of corpses.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's beautiful. It's like poetry.
It is. I will say, Herds, I'm torn on whether to give you a point for this novel.
I was going to ask, do I get points? I don't know. Here's the problem, is that I feel like I wasn't surprised by chapters 3 and 4. I had thought, okay, so obviously these characters are the sinful ones and those are the pure ones. So they're the ones that are going to die and they're the ones that are going to get away. But I hadn't picked the poison. So I did not get at least the murder weapon. But I had picked the murder victims, ?
I mean,
I don't know.
here's the question: had you picked that this was all revenge for them murdering Anthony?
The problem is that in my mind, I was thinking they're going to get their comeuppance. I don't know that I had thought that they had murdered Anthony. I don't think I'd gotten that far. I thought they were just generally villainous characters. So maybe, you know what? Maybe I don't get maybe I get half a point. Do I get half a point?
We do not deal in half points around here, sir.
But in the last one, didn't you say you get a half point if it was a detective who was the killer?
Did I?
You did.
Oh, maybe I deal in half points, but you certainly don't.
This isn't fair. Well, anyway, I'll tell you what. I think that this is my time to shine.
I see.
This is the moment where I'm going to not give you any points for our next case that we're going to be dealing
I see.
with.
I hope you've enjoyed The House in the Mist and collection. I certainly had a fun time, even if it was a bit of a strange departure from our usual field of operations.
It was. I would even say it was an outlier in the detective fiction genre.
Are you about to tell me that it wasn't fair for some absurd reason?
I'm going to tell you, there simply must be a corpse in a detective novel.
I recognize these words.
And the deader the corpse, the better.
Oh, goodness.
Sir.
Is this what I think
we
it
are
is?
going on a journey. I mean, we're not going that far. We're still in America.
In fact, we're just going down the block.
We're going down the block. But we're going down the block. We're going to SS Van Dyne's publishing office firm, whatever it is that he had back in the day. And we're going to be reading the Benson case.
The Benson murder case?
Yeah, the Benson murder case, in which we're going to be following Philo Vance and his premiere adventure. So good luck to that. I wish hope you have a good time.
What chapters, Herds?
What? Well, we're doing chapters 1 to 8, dummy.
Okay, just call me a dummy before I've even solved the story.
You won't solve the story.
I will
This is the
solve
one.
the story.
This is the one that I'll stump you on. There has to be one.
I guess we'll also have to tell the fine people about the Van Dyne rules, which we've addressed
my
a couple of
goodness.
times, but never explicitly.
We'll have to go through all 20 of them. They're a
All
bit
20
wordier
of
than
them.
the Knox Commandments, but hey, I think we can do it.
Oh, goodness.
Like a little movie, you know?
Next time on Death of the Reader, we will have the Benson murder case. We'll see you next week, everyone. And that was this month's books extended cut for Death of the Reader, House in the Mist, Anna Catherine Green, and other stories. I had really good fun with this one.
Yeah, it was a bit of a break from what we usually do, but that's what makes this show fun. We both get to pick a completely different novel and pitch it to the other, and we go through it, and it's a jolly good time.
Yeah, this was definitely more your style of story than it was mine, but it was really fun getting to find a story that kind of bridged the gap between us more than some of the other books that we've covered.
Yeah, less of a strict, complex puzzle, no train puzzles, thankfully, and much more of a story about character growth and morality and political correctness.
Yes, up next week on Death of the Reader, we have the Benson murder case. We're covering chapters 1 to 8, and of course the extended cut will be covering the lot, but we've gone completely the other direction. This is absolutely my kind of story.
We shall see if you're able to solve it, but I wouldn't be surprised if you do.
Yep. This has been the extended cut on Death of the Reader. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we will see you next time.
Next time.